And why the Buddha always chose silence before speaking. Chapter 1. The silence that almost won. Picture a riverbank in the kingdom of Magadha more than 2,500 years ago. The water is low, the air smells of mud and jasmine, and under a fig tree with broad heart-shaped leaves, a man sits so still that a bird lands on his shoulder and does not fly away. He has been sitting like this for weeks. Around him, the ordinary business of the world continues without pause or ceremony, exactly as it had before he sat down, and exactly as it would after he eventually rose. Farmers tend fields not far from where he sits, and travelers pass along the road that skirts the riverbank, most of them never glancing twice at one more thin ascetic among the many wandering that region in that era, seeking enlightenment or simply seeking food. Nothing about the scene announces its own significance. There is no halo in these earliest accounts, no glow, no visible sign distinguishing this particular sitting man from any other seeker who had ever failed to find what he was looking for. Only the bird, perhaps, registers something, the particular natural stillness of a body that has, for reasons it could not articulate, stopped needing to move. This is not a story about a man who found an answer and rushed to share it. This is not a story about a sudden burst of joy that needed to be spoken aloud. This is not a story about certainty looking for an audience. This is a story about a man who found the truth he had been starving for, and for one terrifying stretch of time, almost decided to take it with him into silence forever. His name, before all the titles came later, was Siddhartha Gautama. He had been a prince once, and he had walked away from a palace, a wife, a newborn son, and every comfort a kingdom could offer, because he had seen something on the road outside his father's walls that he could not unsee. An old man bent like a question mark, a sick man shaking with fever, a corpse being carried to the burning ground, suffering not as an idea, as a fact, with a smell and a sound that no wealth could buy its way out of. For 6 years he searched. He starved himself until his ribs cast shadows on his stomach, until a passing herdsman could have mistaken him, in the wrong light, for something already dead and forgotten to bury. And he sat with teachers who promised the edge of the universe and gave him only the edge of exhaustion. He learned the deepest meditative absorptions two of the most respected teachers of his day had to offer. Alara Kalama first, and Udaka Ramaputta, mastered each one so completely that both men in turn told him he had nothing left to learn from them, that he should stay and lead alongside them. He left both times anyway, because mastering their states of deep concentration had not touched the actual root of suffering at all. It had simply given him a finer, calmer place to sit while suffering waited patiently for the concentration to end. So he turned to the opposite extreme. If serenity wouldn't break the chain, perhaps suffering itself would. He ate less and less, by some accounts down to a single grain of rice a day, sometimes nothing at all, until his spine, it is said, could be felt through his stomach when he pressed a hand to his own belly. He held his breath until his ears rang and his skull felt as though it were splitting from the inside. He nearly died trying to think his way out of dying. And the 5 men who would later wait for him at Deer Park were there for almost all of it, watching, matching him hardship for hardship, certain that the man pushing his own body furthest past its limits was the one most likely to break through first, and none of it worked. Not the bliss of deep concentration, not the violence of self-starvation. He had tried, in 6 years, almost every method his era had produced for escaping suffering, and arrived in the end at nothing but a body close to ruin and a mind no closer to peace than the day he had left the palace. Here's what most people miss about what happened next. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It wasn't a voice from the sky. He sat down under that fig tree, the one we now call the Bodhi tree, a tree of awakening, and he simply stopped running. He stopped fighting the question. He let it open all the way you let a wound finally breathe instead of pressing on it. There is, according to later tradition, a kind of resolve attributed to him in this final sitting that distinguishes it from every prior attempt across the preceding 6 years. A determination made consciously before settling into the posture not to rise again until the matter was settled one way or another, regardless of what it cost his body to remain. Whether or not this specific vow was literally spoken aloud in exactly the words later tradition preserves, the underlying shape of it captures something essential about what made this particular sitting different from every other sitting that had come before it, across 6 exhausting years. This was not one more attempt among many, held loosely, ready to be abandoned the moment a better method presented itself. This was the last attempt, made with the full settled weight of someone who had genuinely run out of other directions to search in. And, in that stillness, something gave way. The texts call it nibbana. The word means something like unbinding, the way a flame goes out not because it was defeated, but because the fuel that fed it is gone. Not annihilation, not erasure. The quiet that's left when craving stops feeding the fire of becoming. He saw the chain of cause and effect that drags every living thing from birth to suffering to death and back into birth again. He saw the way out of that chain not as a theory but as a felt, lived, undeniable thing, like finally seeing the floor under your feet after years of falling. It is worth trying even briefly to imagine what this actually felt like from the inside, as much as any description in words can approach an experience. The tradition itself insists, ultimately resists full description. And picture 6 years of searching, every possible angle of attack against suffering already attempted, every teacher already exhausted, every extreme of denial and discipline already tried and found wanting. Suddenly, in a single sustained sitting, simply resolving, not through additional effort layered on top of the effort already spent, through a kind of letting go so total that the chase itself, the very motion of seeking, finally stopped. The relief of that stopping after 6 years of unrelenting motion may be closer to what nibbana felt like in that first moment than any later doctrinal formulation ever quite captures. He had done it, and the thing the old ascetics whispered about in caves, the thing every wandering seeker on every dusty road in northern India was hungry for without knowing its name. He had it now, fully, completely, in his own body, and he sat there and said nothing, not for a day, not for this much. He stayed under that tree and near it for 49 days, 7 weeks, moving from spot to spot around the same small patch of ground, 1 week sitting at the base of the tree itself, 1 week simply standing and gazing at it without blinking as if making sure it was real, 1 week pacing a narrow stretch of path that pilgrims would later mark with stone, 1 week sheltered, by legend, under the hood of a great serpent during a sudden storm. Centuries later, a Chinese traveler named Xuanzang would walk that same ground and describe each of these 7 spots to readers who had never been within 1,000 miles of Magadha. So carefully had the memory of those 49 days been preserved. People do not preserve memories like that by accident. Something about this particular silence mattered enough to outlast empires. Consider what it actually took for that memory to survive at all, across more than 1,000 years, carried by oral tradition long before any of it was written down, passed from teacher to student in a chain stretching across an entire subcontinent and eventually beyond it. Xuanzang did not invent the 7 spots himself. He recorded what local monks and pilgrims in his own era already understood as established sacred fact, markers in the landscape that had presumably been pointed out, generation after generation, by people standing exactly where he now stood, repeating exactly what had been told to them. The 49 days under and around that tree had become, by the time he arrived, not simply a story but a geography, a set of physical locations a person could actually walk to, stand in, and feel something of what had once happened there, the way a battlefield or a birthplace carries weight beyond what any retelling alone could supply. It is worth imagining, too, what it must have been like for the handful of people who may have passed by during those 49 days. Herders moving cattle along the riverbank, perhaps a wandering merchant or two, or ordinary people going about ordinary business who would have seen, without any way of understanding its significance, a gaunt, recently recovered ascetic sitting motionless near a fig tree for what must have looked, at from any distance, like an unusually long and pointless meditation. None of them could have known that the man they glimpsed in passing was, in that very stretch of days, deciding whether an entire spiritual tradition that would eventually outlast every kingdom of his era would exist at all. History rarely announces its hinge points to the people standing closest to them. But here is the part that gets left out of the simple version of the story, the version told to children, the version carved into temple murals where everyone looks serene and certain on. During at least part of those 49 days, the newly awakened Buddha considered something that should stop you cold if you let it. He considered never teaching at all. Think about what that means. And the most important realization of his life, possibly, depending on how seriously you take the claim, one of the most important realizations any human being has ever had about the nature of suffering and its end. And his first instinct, sitting there in the dappled light, was to let it stay exactly where it was, with him, unspoken. Unburdened by the impossible, exhausting, almost certainly futile task of trying to put it into words other people could use. Why would he even consider that? The texts give us his own reasoning, and it is not modest. And he looked out at the world he had just escaped. The world of craving, of grasping, of people building their whole lives around things that cannot last. And what he saw was a species addicted to its own suffering, love with its own chains, decorating its prison cells and calling the decorations happiness. He had spent 6 years trying to find a way out. He knew, more intimately than almost anyone alive, how hard the path was, how much had to be given up, how little most people want to hear that the very things they love most, their bodies, their names, their futures, their certainty about who they are exactly what's keeping them bound. And there is something worth sitting with in the specific bleakness of this assessment, an assessment delivered not by a cynic who had never tried to escape, but by the one person alive who had just personally proven the escape was possible. A bitter man who has never found a way out might reasonably conclude that no way out exists. This was not that, and this was a man who had found the door, walked through it, and was now looking back at a room full of people he had once shared every illusion with, trying to decide whether telling them about the door would even register against the comfort of the walls they had spent their entire lives decorating. He thought, this teaching goes against the current. People are in love with the river. I would be asking them to swim upstream against everything they want. He thought, I would speak and speak and speak. Most of it would land on people too comfortable in their own dust to even notice it was there. There is something worth lingering on in his choice of metaphor here. No, even filtered as it necessarily is through translation and centuries of retelling. A river does not fight the things floating within it. It simply carries them effortlessly in whatever direction it is already moving in. Asking someone to swim against that current is asking them to expend deliberate, sustained effort against a force that costs them nothing to simply continue obeying. Craving, in this image, not a villain forcing people against their will. It is simply the path of least resistance, the direction everything naturally drifts unless something interrupts it. What he was contemplating in those quiet weeks was whether it was worth the cost to himself in the exhausting effort of speaking, and to his listeners the exhausting effort of resisting a current they had never been asked to resist before, of asking an entire civilization to start swimming. This pause is not empty. Pay attention to what's inside it. Inside it is something rarely admitted about compassion. That real compassion sometimes looks, for a long moment, exactly like withdrawal. The same man who would spend the next 45 years walking from village to village, answering questions from kings and beggars alike, very nearly chose, in his first hours of full awakening, to walk away from all of it, not out of cruelty, out of something almost like grief. The grief of having found water in the desert and looking back at people who had built their whole lives around being thirsty and wondering if they would even recognize water if it were placed in their hands. There is a particular cruelty embedded in exactly this kind of grief, worth naming directly because it recurs in smaller form in countless ordinary human situations. The specific pain of seeing clearly what someone else needs, while suspecting with real evidence behind the suspicion that they are not yet ready to receive it, or might actively resist it if offered. Anyone who has watched someone they love continue down a path of obvious harm, fully aware of a better way forward but unable to make that better way land, has tasted some small fraction of what this moment under the tree must have actually felt like, scaled up to the size of an entire civilization rather than a single relationship. Stay with me here, because this is the hinge the whole story turns on. The one you will need to remember in every chapter that follows. Every single time the Buddha later chooses silence, in front of a furious philosopher, in front of a grieving grandmother, in front of a king with his father's blood not yet dry on his hands. That silence will trace back to this first one. This first silence is the seed. Every later refusal to speak, every withheld answer, every long, uncomfortable pause before a response that never quite comes the way the listener wanted, grows out of ground broken right here, under this tree, in these 49 days. A man who had just found the deepest answer in the world almost decided the world wasn't ready to hear it. It is worth being honest about how unsettling this origin point can feel the first time someone actually sits with it, rather than letting it slide past as a quaint detail in an old story. We are accustomed, in nearly every other tradition of heroism we have inherited, to a different shape entirely. A hero discovers the fire and immediately joyfully carries it back to the village to share. Here, instead, the hero discovers the fire and very nearly decides the village does not deserve it or could not be trusted with it, or would only burn itself further trying to use it. That is a far harder, far less flattering origin story than the one most religious traditions prefer to tell about their founders. And yet it is precisely this harder, less flattering version that the earliest layers of this tradition chose to preserve, rather than editing it into something more comfortable. Why would anyone preserve a story that makes their own founder look hesitant and even briefly tempted toward what looks on the surface like abandonment? The most plausible answer, and the one this entire video has been built around demonstrating chapter by chapter, is that the hesitation itself was never actually a flaw to be hidden. It was the proof of how seriously he had weighed the cost of speaking before he ever agreed to pay it. Proof that every word he would go on to speak across the next 45 years had passed through a filter, sharp enough to nearly refuse speech altogether. A teacher who had never doubted whether to teach might have taught carelessly. A teacher who had seriously considered remaining silent forever and chose otherwise only after being shown a compelling reason to believe some would actually listen was a teacher whose every subsequent word carried the full weight of that earlier, nearly opposite decision behind it. The watching world held its breath without knowing it was holding anything at all. And then, this part of the story has always unsettled translators, because it reads less like scripture and more like myth, breaking through the seams of history. The sky noticed. A being named Brahma Sahampati, described in the text as the highest of the gods in that particular cosmic order, is said to have looked down and felt something close to alarm. Here was a being who had broken through to the deepest truth available to any creature in any realm. high or low, human or divine. And he was about to let it die with him, unspoken, the way a single match might be struck and blown out in an empty room with no one there to see the light. We will come back to what Brahma does next, what he asks for, and what it costs the Buddha to grant it. But not yet, because there is something worth sitting with first, the way the Buddha himself sat with it. The sheer strangeness of a sacred history that begins not with confidence, but with hesitation. Every other origin story we tell ourselves about great teachers tends to skip this part. The hero finds the answer. The hero shares the answer. Done. But here, in the oldest layer of this tradition, a hero almost doesn't share anything at all. The most important teaching in this entire religious tradition almost never happened, not because the man wasn't capable of teaching it, but because he had just spent 6 years learning, in his own bones, how little most people want to be taught the truth about their own suffering. There's a detail here easy to miss, and it is this. The silence under the tree was not laziness, it was not fear. No, it was the most honest assessment imaginable of how hard real change actually is. An assessment made by someone who had just paid the highest possible price to make that change himself. He wasn't doubting the truth he had found. None. He was doubting whether anyone would be willing to pay what he had paid to receive it. Sit with that for a second before we move on. A man finds the deepest peace available to any living being, and his first considered, sober, a fully awakened thought is, most people will not want this. Consider, too, what his body must have looked like in those weeks. Note, because the texts do not let us forget it entirely, even as they turn toward the philosophical weight of the moment. He had only recently abandoned the most extreme of his ascetic practices, accepting food again, regaining some of the strength 6 years of deprivation had stripped from him. He was not yet the serene, rounded figure later art would carve from stone and cast in bronze. He was a gaunt, weathered man in worn robes, and, sitting alone at the edge of a small forest, watched occasionally by herders moving cattle along the riverbank, none of whom had any reason to suspect that the stillest man any of them had ever seen was, at that very moment, deciding the fate of a teaching that would eventually reach further than any kingdom either of his old teachers had ever ruled. Greatness, in this story, never announces itself. It simply sits unnoticed, exactly where it always was. That is where we begin. Not with a sermon, not with a miracle, with a man under a tree holding the most valuable thing a human being has ever held, seriously weighing whether to simply let it go quiet, the way a stone sinks without a ripple into still water. 49 days, 7 spots of ground, one silence so heavy that, according to the oldest stories that have come down to us, it reached all the way up into the heavens and disturbed something there. The shadow falls across the clearing before the sound does. Long, deliberate, unhurried, the way a being who has never needed to rush moves through a world built for things that die. Sahampati has come down from his realm, and what he is about to ask for will set in motion everything that follows. Every sermon, every silence, every refusal to answer, every answer given exactly when it was needed and not one moment before. But that conversation, the one between a god and a man who had almost decided to say nothing at all, belongs to what comes next. Chapter 2, what the god begged for he had decided. The teaching would end with him. Here, this small clearing, unspoken and unrepeated, the way a single candle burns down to nothing in a room no one enters. Then the sky disagreed. Notice the deliberate economy of that opening sentence, and what it tells us about how settled this decision had genuinely become before anything intervened. Not he was leaning toward or he was still weighing, he had decided. The matter, as far as he himself was concerned in that moment, was closed. Whatever happens next in this chapter happens specifically against the backdrop of a decision already made, already settled, already at rest, which makes whatever follows considerably more remarkable than if the Buddha had simply been caught mid-deliberation, still genuinely undecided when the intervention arrived. The texts describe it plainly, almost matter-of-factly, the way you might describe weather. Brahma Sahampati, lord of a high heavenly realm, perceived the thought arising in the newly awakened mind below him, and felt something the old commentaries translate, awkwardly but honestly, as dismay. Imagine the strangeness of that image, a god, troubled, not by war, not by a fallen kingdom, not by some catastrophe sweeping through the world of men, troubled by a single decision being made in silence under a tree by one man who had just become something the universe had never quite seen in exactly this way before. Sahampati did not argue, he did not lecture, and he knelt robe-arranged with one shoulder bare, the posture of deepest respect, and made his case in a single image, the kind of image that survives translation across languages and centuries, because it is so simple a child could understand it, and so precise a philosopher could not improve it. Consider the deliberate restraint embedded in choosing a single simple agricultural image over an extended philosophical argument, and especially coming from a being the tradition describes as occupying one of the highest possible positions within an entire cosmology of heavenly realms. Sahampati could presumably have constructed an elaborate cosmic case, and, drawing on whatever vast knowledge his exalted position afforded him, layering argument upon argument until the sheer weight of evidence became impossible to set aside. He chose instead a kind of image any farmer working the muddy fields along that same riverbank would have recognized instantly from a single glance at his own flooded rice paddy. The lesson in that choice is its own small demonstration of exactly the discipline this entire story is concerned with. Meeting the listener exactly where understanding is actually possible, rather than where the speaker's own capability happens to be greatest. There are lotus flowers, he said, growing in muddy ponds. Some never break the surface of the water and rot beneath it, never seeing light. Some rise exactly to the surface and rest there, neither above nor below. And some climb all the way up and out, unstained by the mud they grew from, opening fully into the sun. And picture the pond itself as Sahampati must have intended it to be pictured. Not a single flower, but countless thousands of them, rooted in the same dark mud, drawing from the same murky water, and yet standing, at any given moment, at every possible stage between buried and blooming. Some so deep in the silt that no light reaches them at all, no matter how strong the sun above the water's surface. And some pressed right up against the underside of the surface itself, close enough that the faintest disturbance from above might be enough to break them through. The image was not meant to flatter humanity, and it did not. It was meant to sort it, honestly, into categories the Buddha could actually use, rather than leave him staring at an undifferentiated mass of suffering vast for any one teacher to meaningfully address. People, he said, are like that. Some are buried so deep in confusion they will never rise no matter what anyone says to them. But some have only a little dust covering their eyes, a little, not none, just enough that they cannot yet see clearly on their own, but not so much that the right word, spoken at the right moment, could not clear it away entirely. Notice what just happened in that image. It is not a demand. It is not even quite a request. It is an offering of a different way of seeing the very despair that had led to the silence in the first place. The Buddha had looked at humanity and seen accurately an overwhelming mass of craving and confusion. Sahampati was not disputing that picture. He was asking him to look again, more carefully, at the edges of it, at the small number of beings standing right at the surface of the water, lotus stems straining upward, who needed only one thing, someone willing to speak. There is something quietly instructive in the very method Sahampati chose here. Something easy to overlook in favor of simply marveling at a god appearing at all. He did not attempt to overwhelm the Buddha's judgment with raw authority, the way a lesser story might have written the scene, a divine being commanding obedience by virtue of rank alone. He persuaded. He offered a single, carefully chosen image and trusted the Buddha's own already demonstrated capacity for careful reasoning to do the rest. In a story that will spend chapter after chapter examining exactly when and how persuasion should or should not be attempted, It is worth noting that even the being who broke the Buddha's silence chose persuasion over command, not argument over decree, modeling in his very first appearance in this tradition the same respect for an autonomous mind's own process of weighing evidence that the Buddha himself would go on to practice with every difficult listener across the rest of this story. Have a moment to consider this, and this is where it gets remarkable. The Buddha is said to have surveyed the world again with what the texts call the divine eye, not casual observation, but a deliberate, almost clinical scan of the minds of living beings everywhere, sorting them the way Sahampati had described, by how much dust covered each pair of eyes, some thick with it, some nearly clear. He looked, in other words, before he answered. He did not simply accept the God's framing because a God offered it. He checked it against what he could actually see. And consider what this single detail tells us about everything that follows across the rest of this story. The decision to teach was not made on faith in a deity's persuasive image, however beautiful that image was. And it was made on direct verification, on the Buddha's own insistence on looking for himself rather than accepting even a celestial being's word at face value. This habit, checking claims against direct observation rather than simply trusting authority, even an authority as exalted as a god kneeling before him, would resurface again and again in the chapters ahead. Every time someone demanded he simply declare an answer rather than examine what the actual situation in front of him required. And what he saw changed the decision. Pali Sanskrit note for the listener following closely. The texts use the word samadhi to describe the deep gathered stillness from which this entire scene unfolds. Not an ordinary kind of attention, but a fully unified, unscattered mind. The same quality of stillness that let him survey the minds of countless beings in something like a single unbroken glance. Without that depth of stillness, the survey itself would have been impossible, and the silence under the tree was never empty. It was the very instrument that let him see clearly enough to know whether speaking was worth the cost. It is worth distinguishing this kind of stillness clearly from anything resembling ordinary daydreaming or simple rest, the casual sort of quiet most people experience as merely the absence of activity. Samadhi, not as it is described across this tradition, is closer to the opposite of absence, a fully concentrated, fully present gathering of attention so complete that it becomes capable of perceiving things ordinary, scattered attention never could. The 49 days were not, in this light, an empty pause between the real events of awakening and the real events of teaching. They were themselves an active, ending labor. The labor of holding attention steady enough for long enough that an accurate survey of an entire world's worth of suffering minds could actually be conducted from within it. So he agreed, not eagerly, not with relief. The texts give us almost nothing of triumph in this moment, none of the language you would expect from a man who has just decided to found one of the great teaching traditions of human history. None. What we get instead is something closer to a sigh. The sigh of someone agreeing to carry a weight because the alternative, watching people drown within arm's reach of the surface and doing nothing, was heavier still. This matters more than it might seem to on first hearing. The most famous teacher in the history of Buddhism did not begin his teaching career because he wanted to be heard. He began it because he was, in effect, not talked out of his silence by an argument about lotus flowers, and even then, only partially. He did not promise to save everyone. He did not claim the dust would lift from every eye that heard him speak. And he agreed to speak for the ones close enough to the surface that speech could actually reach them, and implicitly, by omission, declined to promise anything for the rest. Here's where the story turns, and it turns on something almost nobody notices the first time they hear it. The very God who convinced him to break his silence did so using the language of patience, not urgency. Sahampati did not say, "Hurry, they're drowning." "Go now," he said, in effect, "some are almost ready, not all some." And the whole turning point of the most consequential silence in the tradition rests on a distinction between speaking to everyone and speaking to the ones who are close enough to be reached, a distinction the Buddha would return to again and again. In chapter after chapter of what follows, whenever someone demanded he answer a question that wasn't, in fact, theirs to receive yet. Walk with that thought a moment, because it is the real beginning of everything. Hope here, not naive. Hope in this story is selective, deliberate, almost surgical, closer to a doctor choosing which patients can survive the surgery than to a preacher promising salvation to a crowd. And the Buddha did not leave that clearing because he suddenly believed in everyone. He left it because he had been shown, carefully and specifically, that some could be reached, and decided that was reason enough to try. And there is a meaningful difference, worth drawing out explicitly, between the kind of hope that requires believing everything will work out for everyone, and the kind of hope on display in this particular moment. A hope that requires believing only that the effort is worth making for whoever can actually receive it, regardless of how many others remain beyond reach. The first kind of hope tends to collapse the moment evidence accumulates against it. The moment enough people fail to respond to confirm the believer's earlier optimism. The second kind of hope, the kind modeled here, survives exactly that accumulation of evidence, because it never depended on universal success in the first place. It depended only on the much narrower, much more defensible claim that some lotus stems were close enough to the surface to be worth reaching toward. He rose from where he had been sitting. Above him, Sahampati is said to have bowed once, circled him respectfully, and vanished back into whatever realm he had come from. His single errand, perhaps the most consequential errand any deity performs in the entire Pali canon. Complete, it is worth pausing before moving forward on how little fanfare accompanies a moment this significant. No chorus of celestial voices, no transformation of the landscape. A god knelt, made an argument out of mud and flowers, and left. Man who had nearly let everything die in silence simply stood, dusted off whatever remained of 6 years of wandering clinging to his robes, and began walking in the direction of people he had once known. A most consequential decision in the history of this teaching looked, from the outside, like almost nothing at all happening. Pilgrimage accounts from centuries later, including one left by an earlier Chinese traveler named Faxian, who journeyed through the region generations before Xuanzang followed in his footsteps, describe entire networks of shrines and markers built specifically to commemorate sites connected to this period of the Buddha's life. Not only the 7 spots of the 49 days, but also the path he is believed to have walked from that clearing toward Sarnath, a journey of roughly 150 miles that pilgrims centuries afterward would deliberately retrace on foot, step by step, as an act of devotion in itself. The road from indecision to teaching had become by then a road literally worn smooth by the feet of people trying to understand what it had cost him to walk it the first time. And the man who had nearly let the deepest truth available to any living being die in silence began instead to walk. He did not yet know exactly who he would speak to first, but he remembered 5 men. 5 men who had once shared his hunger, who had once sat beside him in those years of starving and striving, who had watched him eventually abandon the most extreme practices and walked away from him in disgust, not convinced he had given up, convinced he had gone soft. He thought of them now, not with resentment, but with something more like an old debt remembered. They had been close. Closer perhaps than anyone else alive, to the surface of that pond. There was a kind of quiet justice in choosing them first, even though the choice could not have been an easy one to make. Of everyone he might have approached with this new, unprecedented teaching, these 5 had the most reason to dismiss him outright, having watched him personally abandon the very method they still believed was the only legitimate path. A more cautious strategist, thinking carefully about how to launch a new teaching successfully, might have chosen an easier audience first. Strangers with no prior history of disappointment in him, no specific grudge already loaded and waiting. He chose, instead, the hardest possible room, the 5 people most likely to laugh him away before he finished his first sentence. Whatever else this decision reveals, it reveals a teacher unconcerned with managing the optics of his own first public teaching, concerned instead with simply repaying as best he could a debt of shared suffering to the people who had earned it most. And he turned his feet toward Sarnath, toward Deer Park, toward 5 men who had every reason in the world not to listen to him. Chapter 3, 5 men who almost walked away. The road to Sarnath is long and dusty, and the man walking it, no following yet, no robe of the kind later generations would picture, no reputation beyond a rumor that the ascetic Gautama, the one who had pushed self-denial further than almost anyone they knew, had abandoned the practice and was, depending on who told the story, either enlightened or simply broken. The distance itself was no small thing, well over 100 miles on foot, across open country and through small villages, the kind of journey that gives a person a great deal of time to second-guess a decision already made. He could have turned toward easier audiences. He could have sought out strangers who knew nothing of his past failures, who would meet him fresh, without 6 years of disappointed expectation already loaded against him. Instead, he chose deliberately the 5 men most likely to dismiss him outright, not because it would be easy, but because he owed them something, a debt of shared suffering that made them, in his own accounting, the first people who deserved to hear what he had found, however unwelcome the news of his apparent failure had made him in their eyes. The 5 men waiting at Deer Park had chosen sides on that question already. They had decided he was broken. They had been his companions during the hardest years, the years of counting grains of rice, of holding his breath until his vision blurred, of testing exactly how little a human body could survive on. They had respected him then, the way you respect anyone willing to suffer more than you are. Then they had watched him accept a bowl of rice milk from a passing village girl, watched him eat, watched the most disciplined man any of them had ever known choose comfort over deprivation. They left him. In their eyes, no, he had quit. So when they saw him approaching Deer Park, they made a pact among themselves, the kind of small defensive pact people make when they're afraid of being disappointed again. They would not rise to greet him. They would not bow. They would address him by name only, with none of the honorific titles a respected teacher deserved, to make absolutely clear that nothing between them had changed, that they still saw exactly what they expected to see, a man who had given up. There is something quietly familiar in this pact, easy to recognize from far smaller disappointments in ordinary life. And anyone who has watched a friend or family member apparently abandon a shared commitment and felt the particular sting of believing yourself betrayed by someone you once respected knows the specific defensive posture 5 men can fall into without ever needing to discuss it explicitly beforehand. The pact was not cruelty, it was protection, a shared agreement not to be disappointed again by someone who had already, in their eyes, disappointed them once. Here's what most retellings rush past and we won't. As he got closer, something in his bearing made every part of that pact collapse before he even spoke a word. One by one, without planning it, without discussing it, the 5 men found themselves rising anyway. One took his bowl and robe on. One prepared a seat. One brought water for his feet. Whatever they had decided with their minds, something in what they were looking at, the stillness of his walk, the clarity in his face, none of them had words for yet, overrode it completely. There is something worth noticing in how completely this moment bypasses argument altogether. The very first hint of a pattern this entire story will spend the next 14 chapters exploring in increasingly difficult forms. 5 men had reasoned their way, carefully and deliberately, into a defensive pact. No counter-argument broke that pact. No clever opening line dismantled their suspicion piece by piece. Something simply visible in how he carried himself did the work instead, before a single word had been exchanged. The body itself in this moment communicating something words had not yet been given the chance to confirm or deny, and even then, even rising, even preparing a seat, they could not quite let go of their suspicion. They still addressed him with the familiar, slightly dismissive form of address, still calling him only by name, as if testing whether the old, defeated friend they expected was still in there somewhere. He told them plainly, "Do not call me that. I have found what we were all looking for. Listen, and I will teach it to you." They were skeptical. Of course they were. They reminded him, not unkindly but firmly, that he had failed even the most extreme practices they had attempted together. What reason did they have to believe he had now succeeded where such effort had failed? Then, picture the position each of these 5 men was actually standing in during this exchange. They had each given up years of their own lives to a shared project of extreme self-denial. A project they had pursued in part because they trusted the judgment of the man now claiming to have found something beyond it. To accept his claim meant, implicitly, accepting that the years they had all spent together pursuing the most extreme path had been, if not wasted, then at least insufficient on their own. A difficult admission for anyone who has invested heavily in a particular method to make about that very method. He asked them a simple question in return. Had he ever spoken to them like this before, with this particular tone, this particular certainty? They admitted he had not. And in that small admission, not in any miracle, not in any vision, the first crack of real listening opened. What he taught them that afternoon, sitting in Deer Park as the light went long and gold across the grass, would later be called the first turning of the wheel, and at its center was a word that would echo through every chapter that follows in this story. Dukkha. Suffering, yes, but something wider and more precise than the English word suggests. Dukkha is the friction in things, a way even pleasant experiences carry within them, the seed of their own ending. The way a cartwheel out of alignment will eventually grind itself apart no matter how smoothly the road first feels. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha. Sickness is dukkha. Death is dukkha. Even getting what you want is dukkha eventually, because what you want changes and what you got does not satisfy for long. There is a particular precision in choosing a cartwheel as the underlying image for this entire concept, one that would not have been lost on 5 men who had spent years walking dusty roads on foot, watching countless actual carts groan and shudder under loads they were never quite built to carry smoothly. A wheel slightly out of true does not announce its flaw with every rotation. It can roll for miles seeming perfectly fine, the misalignment only gradually making itself known through a wear pattern, a faint vibration, a slow accumulation of damage that eventually, inevitably, brings the whole cart grinding to a halt. Suffering in exactly this image rarely announces itself as suffering in the moment it is actually being generated. It accumulates quietly in the slight, persistent friction of craving something to stay the same when everything, by its very nature, is already in the process of changing. He laid out 4 truths, simple enough to state in a single breath and deep enough that entire schools of thought would spend the next 2,500 years unpacking them. Suffering exists. Suffering has a cause. Suffering has an end. There is a path to that end. And the path itself, the one he called the middle way, was neither the indulgence of the palace he'd left nor the self-destruction of the years he'd just abandoned. And it was something narrower and harder to hold than either extreme, a careful, sustained, moderate effort, the kind that doesn't announce itself with drama but simply, patiently, works. Notice how directly this first teaching answers the very temptation he had nearly succumbed to under the Bodhi tree. He had worried, in his silence, that people were too attached to the things that bound them to ever willingly let go. And here, in his very first sermon, he does not demand that attachment disappear by force of will or denial. He offers a middle path, neither indulging the craving nor violently suppressing it, but understanding it clearly enough that its grip naturally loosens. The fear that had nearly silenced him forever turns out to have already contained within it the seed of the method that would address it. This is where it gets remarkable. As he spoke, something happened in the mind of one of the 5 men, a man named Kundana, that the texts mark as the very first moment of awakening to occur in anyone other than the Buddha himself. And something Kundana had been groping toward his entire ascetic life suddenly arranged itself into a complete, coherent shape. Whatever has the nature of arising also has the nature of passing away. Simple words. And yet the Buddha, watching Kundana's face change, is recorded as having said with what must have been enormous relief, "Kundana knows. Kundana has understood." The other 4 took longer, days in some accounts. But over the days that followed, walking and sitting and listening and questioning, each of the remaining 4, Vapa, Badia, Mahanama, Asaji, arrived at the same understanding in turn, until all 5 men who had once turned their backs on him in disgust had become arahants, fully liberated beings, the very first community of awakened disciples in the history of this teaching. Notice who broke first. Notice what that tells you about everything that follows in this story. It was not the most senior of the 5. It was not the most respected. It was the one whose mind, perhaps through some combination of temperament and prior effort, simply had the least dust covering it. Exactly the kind of distinction Sahampati had pointed to under the Bodhi tree, made suddenly, vividly concrete in 5 specific named men sitting in a deer park. It is worth noting, too, how the remaining 4 men, Vapa, Badia, Mahanama, and Asaji, responded to Kundana's breakthrough in the days that followed, and because their response says something about the kind of community this teaching was already, from its very first hours, beginning to produce. There is no record of jealousy, no record of impatience at being left behind, while their companion arrived first at the very thing all 5 had spent years pursuing together. They simply continued listening, continued practicing, trusting that whatever had happened for Kundana remained available to each of them in turn, on whatever timeline their own minds required. This absence of competitive anxiety, so easy to overlook in a story this dense with other dramatic detail, is itself a quiet demonstration of exactly the kind of community the Buddha's careful and individualized teaching was capable of producing, one where each person's different pace toward the same goal was simply accepted as different pace, rather than treated as a contest with winners and losers. A community had formed where days before there had been only suspicion and a half-broken pact not to bow, and it had formed not because the Buddha overwhelmed 5 skeptics with the sheer force of his presence, but because he spoke carefully, patiently, exactly as much as each of them was ready to receive, and not one word more. What this small group at Deer Park did not yet know, could not possibly have known, sitting on the grass in the fading light of that first afternoon, was that they had just become something the world had not seen before. A community built not around a fixed set of beliefs handed down by decree, but around a method tested and adjusted person by person that depended entirely on the teacher's willingness to read each listener with exactly the kind of care Sahampati had once urged him to use. And 5 men had walked away from him in disgust. 5 men now sat as the founding members of what would, within the Buddha's own lifetime, grow into a community spanning much of northern India. The pattern that would govern every chapter still ahead of us. Speak when speaking serves, withhold when withholding serves, and never confuse the two, had just been tested for the first time on the hardest possible audience. People who already believed they knew exactly who he was and were wrong. Deer Park itself, by the time Faxian and Xuanzang each separately recorded their visits centuries later, had grown into a substantial complex of monasteries, stupas, and pillars, including one famous stone column raised generations afterward by the same Emperor Ashoka whose own silent reckoning we encountered in connection with Malunkyaputa's poisoned arrow, a monument marking, deliberately and permanently, the exact spot where this story's first real turning point had occurred. What had begun as 5 suspicious men sitting cross-legged on open grass had become, by the time later pilgrims arrived to pay respects, one of the most carefully preserved sacred sites in the entire subcontinent. Every detail of that first afternoon's geography fixed in stone for travelers who would never meet anyone who had actually been there. On Chapter 4. The arrow still in the wound, by now the pattern has started, even if no one watching it yet has a name for it. 5 men listened and were changed. But not everyone who came to the Buddha in the years that followed wanted what Kandana wanted. Some came wanting something else entirely. Certainty about questions that had nothing to do with suffering at all. A monk named Malunkyaputta was one of these. He had been part of the community for some time, sitting through teachings, practicing the discipline, and yet something gnawed at him that no amount of practice seemed to settle. He wanted to know whether the universe was eternal or not eternal, whether it was finite or infinite, whether the soul and the body were the same thing or different things, whether an awakened being continued to exist after death or ceased entirely, or both or neither. By every indication in the text, Malunkyaputta was not a foolish man nor a lazy one. He had likely come from a background, as many monks of the era did, where philosophical debate was treated as a serious discipline in its own right, where a teacher's credibility was measured partly by his willingness to take a position on exactly these kinds of cosmic questions and defend it. Malunkyaputta, a teacher who declined to stake out a position on the eternity of the universe, was not practicing humility. He was failing a basic obligation any serious philosopher owed his students. The broader intellectual culture of the era, as far as the surviving texts allow us to reconstruct it, was thick with exactly this kind of debate. Wandering teachers and their followers staking elaborate, competing claims about the ultimate nature of reality, the soul, the cosmos, often with real social prestige attached to whoever could defend the most comprehensive and confidently stated system. Kiaputta's frustration makes a great deal more sense once you place him inside that competitive intellectual environment, rather than judging him against modern assumptions about what religious humility ought to look like. He was not asking for reassurance. He was asking for the kind of complete metaphysical system that every other serious teacher of his era seemed prepared to offer, and finding instead a teacher who simply declined to play that particular game at all. These were not idle questions to him. They felt to Malunkyaputta like the foundation everything else should be built on. Now, how could you walk a spiritual path without knowing, at minimum, what kind of universe you were walking it in? So one afternoon he went to the Buddha and laid out his demand with the bluntness of a man who has rehearsed his complaint many times in his own head before saying it aloud. If the teacher will not answer these questions, he said, I will leave the order. I would rather know clearly that he cannot answer them and abandon the training, than continue practicing in ignorance of the very framework I am practicing within. There is a particular kind of courage, however misdirected, embedded in issuing an ultimatum like this one openly, to the very person holding all the institutional authority in the room. Malunkyaputta was not whispering his frustration to other monks behind the Buddha's back, building a quiet faction of the discontented the way Devadatta would later attempt more deliberately. And he brought his complaint directly to its source, staked everything on a single demand, and made clear exactly what continuing his membership in the community would now cost if that demand went unmet. Whatever else this moment reveals about Malunkyaputa's particular confusion, it does not reveal cowardice. It reveals a man willing to risk everything he had built within this community on the strength of a single conviction about what a teacher owed his students. This is not a quiet threat. This is a monk inside the community. putting an ultimatum on the table, and here in front of a man prepared to walk away entirely. The Buddha did something that has confused, frustrated, and fascinated readers of these texts for over 2,000 years. He did not answer the question. He told a story instead. Imagine, he said, a man struck by a poisoned arrow. His family rushes a surgeon to him, and the wounded man says, "Wait, before you remove this arrow, none. I need to know who shot it, what clan, what family, what was his name. I need to know what kind of bow was used, what the bowstring was made of, what kind of wood the shaft was carved from, what kind of feather was fletched to its end, what poison exactly was applied to the tip. Until I know all of this, I will not allow you to treat the wound." And picture the absurdity of this scene as it would have actually unfolded in front of anyone watching, because the absurdity is precisely the rhetorical weapon the Buddha was wielding here. A family in genuine crisis, a surgeon ready and waiting, every second of delay measurably increasing the danger, and the wounded man in the grip of his own curiosity, holding the entire rescue hostage to a list of questions that, however legitimately interesting, none of which could be answered quickly enough to matter before the poison finished its work. Anyone hearing this story for the first time would have immediately recognized the wounded man's behavior as foolish, even as they recognized, with a slightly uncomfortable jolt, that his specific questions were not unreasonable on their own terms. That discomfort, recognizing the folly while still understanding the impulse behind it, is exactly what the parable was built to produce. The man, the Buddha said simply, would die. He would die with every one of his questions perfectly reasonable, perfectly understandable, and entirely unanswered, because there was never enough time to answer them before the poison did its work. Consider how carefully constructed this parable actually is, because it rewards a second, slower look. And the Buddha did not say the wounded man's questions were stupid, or beneath consideration, or unworthy of an intelligent mind. Notice that. He granted implicitly that knowing the archer's clan, the wood of the arrow, the binding of the feathers, might all be perfectly true, knowable facts about the world, exactly the kind of facts a curious mind would want gathered. The failure was never in the questions themselves, and the failure was in the order of operations, in believing that any of those facts needed to be settled before the only action that could actually save a life was permitted to begin. There is a further layer to this parable worth drawing out, one that becomes clearer the longer you sit with it. The wounded man in the story is not simply curious. He is in his own mind and, being responsible, gathering evidence before acting, refusing to proceed on an assumption he cannot yet verify. This is exactly the kind of caution that, in almost any other context, would be praised as careful, rigorous thinking. The parable's entire force comes from showing how even genuinely reasonable habits of mind, applied to the wrong moment, can become lethal. Vacchagotta was not foolish to want certainty before committing himself further to a path. He was, however, mistaken about which question actually required certainty first, and which question could safely wait indefinitely while the more urgent work of pulling the arrow proceeded without it. It is worth imagining, too, how this same parable might land differently depending on who is hearing it. A monk freshly arrived at the threshold of serious practice, still uncertain whether to commit fully, might hear in this story permission to set aside doubts that had been paralyzing him. A monk already deep into practice, suddenly confronted with a genuinely difficult ethical dilemma requiring careful deliberation before acting, might need a different lesson entirely. One this story does not offer here, because here was not the moment for it. A parable does its work precisely because it was offered to the one person in the one moment where this exact lesson was the lesson actually needed. This is not evasion. This is not ignorance. This is not fear of the question. And this is a direct, deliberate redirection toward the only question that mattered in the room. Are you suffering right now? And is there a path out of it? And whether the universe is eternal does not change whether craving causes suffering. Whether the soul and body are identical does not change whether grasping leads to grief. The questions Malunkyaputta wanted answered were not false, not exactly. They might even have true answers, somewhere in some sense. But answering them would not pull the arrow out, and the arrow was the only thing actually killing anyone. The texts have a specific word for this category of question, one worth holding on to because it will return again later in this story. Avyakata, the undeclared, the set-aside, not because the Buddha did not know. The commentaries are careful to insist, and not because the questions were forbidden, but because declaring an answer in either direction would not serve liberation and might actively distract from it. Man, obsessed with the exact composition of the arrow that struck him, is a man who has stopped attending to his own wound. The silence here was not a wall, it was a hand. Firmly but gently, turning Malunkyaputa's face back toward the one thing that could actually save him. None. It is worth noting that the list of undeclared questions recorded across the canon is not arbitrary or random. It clusters consistently around exactly the kind of grand, nodalizing metaphysical claims that promise certainty about everything at once. The eternity of the cosmos, the ultimate fate of the self after death, the nature of the universe in its entirety. These are, not coincidentally, the very questions that tend to generate the most confident, least useful answers from religious and philosophical systems throughout history. Answers that satisfy the intellect's hunger for completeness while doing nothing whatsoever to loosen the grip of craving that actually produces suffering day to day. The Buddha's silence on these specific questions was, in this light, less a gap in his teaching than a deliberate fence built around exactly the territory most likely to seduce a serious mind away from the work actually in front of it. There's a detail here easy to miss in how the story is usually told. Malunkyaputta did not get an apology for being refused, and he did not get a consolation prize. He got instead, something far more demanding. A teacher who respected him enough not to hand him an easy answer wrapped in metaphysics, and who trusted that the real question, the one about suffering and its end, was hard enough and rich enough to occupy an entire lifetime without ever touching the eternity or non-eternity of the cosmos. The poet Ashvaghosha, writing his Sanskrit life of the Buddha centuries after these events, captures something of this same quality in his account of an earlier moment, the great departure from the palace itself, describing not a man fleeing recklessly into the unknown, but one who, having weighed the matter with full and sober clarity, simply walked, without drama, toward a decision that would have devastated everyone who loved him. The same unhurried, undramatic clarity Ashvaghosha attributes to the young prince, leaving his sleeping wife and infant son behind, is recognizably the same clarity governing the older man's refusal to be drawn into a debate about cosmic origins decades later. And whatever else changed across those years of searching, this particular quality of mind, the refusal to be rushed into a decision before it was actually ready to be made, appears to have remained constant from the very beginning on. What happened to Malunkyaputta after this exchange, the texts do not dwell on dramatically. No thunderclap, no instant conversion. But there is no record of him leaving the order in protest either. The ultimatum, once met with the patient, devastating logic of the poisoned arrow, seems simply to have dissolved. If this moment is landing for you, if you've ever demanded an answer to a question that, in hindsight, mattered far less than the wound you were actually standing in, that's worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward. And which question in your own life has been the arrow you keep asking about the bow instead of pulling out? It is worth noticing, too, how often this exact substitution happens in far more ordinary circumstances than ancient philosophical debate. And a person facing a difficult medical diagnosis who spends weeks researching every possible alternative explanation rather than beginning the treatment already recommended. No, a person in a failing relationship who insists on understanding exactly why things went wrong before agreeing to any change in how they themselves behave going forward. A A person facing financial trouble who wants a complete account of every decision that led to the current crisis before taking even the first practical step toward fixing it. None of these desires for explanation are unreasonable on their own terms. All of them held too tightly, can function exactly like Malankya-Buddha's metaphysical questions, perfectly understandable curiosities standing directly between a person and the arrow still lodged in their own side. This is the kind of stillness you can still hear centuries later in a story that has outlived every empire that existed when it was first told. And it would not be the last time someone tried to drag the Buddha into a debate he had no intention of winning by argument. The discipline on display in this single exchange, refusing to let a genuinely interesting but ultimately unhelpful question dictate the terms of the conversation, turns out to be one of the most transferable lessons in this entire story, and transferable enough that it would resurface in radically different form in the conduct of a king who never personally heard a single word the Buddha ever spoke. Centuries after these events, a king who had never met the Buddha and never would, a king named Ashoka, ruler of nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, would face his own version of the poisoned arrow. After a war against the kingdom of Kalinga so brutal that the historical record, even allowing for exaggeration, describes well over 100,000 dead, Ashoka did not immediately issue proclamations or excuses or justifications. The stone edicts he later carved across his empire describe in his own words a period of deep remorse. A silence, an interior reckoning before a single word of policy was carved into rock. Picture the scale of what this required from a ruler of his position. Kings of this era were not generally expected to publicly process guilt. They were expected to project unwavering strength, to justify their conquests as necessary, glorious, divinely sanctioned. And Ashoka's edicts do something almost without precedent for a ruler of his era. They describe his own past violence in terms close to confession rather than celebration, and they do so only after he had clearly spent considerable time sitting with the weight of what he had ordered, rather than rushing to spin it into triumph the moment the fighting ended. And only after that wordless period did the edicts emerge. Calls for restraint, for the protection of animal life, for tolerance among different religious paths, for something the inscriptions call conquest by Dhamma rather than conquest by the sword. A king who had every reason to explain himself, to justify the war, to debate its necessity, instead let the silence do its work first. And only then spoke, and what he said when he finally did speak had been changed entirely by what the silence had caused him to sit through. The arrow in his case was guilt, and he did not try to explain the bow that fired it. He pulled it out first in private and let the explaining come later if it came at all. It is worth pausing on the sheer improbability of this connection before moving forward into the next chapter. A teaching about a poisoned arrow offered to one frustrated monk in one specific conversation, somehow still recognizable. Generations later, in the conduct of an emperor who ruled over a subcontinent and never personally encountered the man who first told it. Ideas this durable do not survive by accident. They survive because they describe something true enough about how guilt, grief, and unresolved questions actually behave in a human mind that anyone in any era facing their own version of an unanswerable question can recognize the shape of the lesson the moment they need it. Before we go further into the chapters ahead, where this same pattern of silence shows up in front of kings, killers, and grieving mothers, it helps to have this video saved somewhere you can find it again. There's a lot more of this thread still to pull. And here's a question worth sitting with before the next chapter begins. Has someone ever refused to answer your question directly and turned out later to have been right to refuse? Tell me about it below. Chapter 5, the question about the self. By now the pattern has a shape, even if no one around the Buddha has put a name to it yet. He answers some questions fully, he redirects others, and every so often he does neither. He simply says nothing at all. and lets the silence itself become the entire response. Notice how much groundwork the previous chapters have already laid before this third category even arrives. The 5 ascetics at Deer Park received a full, direct teaching because they were ready for it and the moment called for clarity. Malunkyaputta received a redirection rather than an answer because his question, however sincere, was aimed at the wrong target entirely. And what comes next belongs to neither category, and it is in some ways the hardest of the 3 to understand from the outside because it offers the listener nothing at all to carry away. No doctrine, no parable, not even a pointed redirection. Just silence, held for reasons the listener will have to discover for himself if he discovers them at all. This happened most famously with a wandering ascetic named Vacchagotta, and known across the region for his sharp questions and his habit of testing every teacher he encountered with the same handful of difficult inquiries. None. He was not a hostile interrogator in the way some who approached the Buddha were. By most accounts, he returned again and again over the years, genuinely curious, genuinely unsettled by questions he could not resolve on his own, a kind of seeker who keeps circling the same well because he suspects correctly that there is water somewhere down there if only the right rope were lowered. One day he came to the Buddha and asked directly, no poisoned arrow parable available to soften the demand. Is there a self? The Buddha said nothing. Picture the scene as it likely unfolded. Vacchagotta seated across from a teacher he had sought out specifically, having traveled some distance, having rehearsed perhaps the very question he was now asking, and receiving in return nothing at all. No nod, no raised hand suggesting patience, simply silence, held for long enough that any ordinary conversational rhythm would have demanded someone fill it. It is worth remembering that this was not the only time Vacchagotta appears in the texts. That fact matters for understanding what kind of silence this actually was. He returned on other occasions recorded elsewhere in the canon, with different questions and received at times, full and careful answers, explanations of the teaching offered at length, with evident patience when the question he brought was one capable of being answered safely. The silence in this particular encounter, then, was never a blanket policy toward this one persistent seeker. It was a response calibrated to this one specific question, on this one specific day, weighed against everything the Buddha understood about exactly where Vacchagotta's confusion was likely to lead him if handled carelessly. The same man could receive silence on one visit and careful instruction on another, and both responses, however different they looked from the outside, were governed by the identical underlying discipline. Vacchagotta tried again from the other direction. Then is there no self? The Buddha said nothing again. Vacchagotta, understandably frustrated by 2 questions, met with identical, total silence, eventually got up and left. Notice who breaks first in a moment like this. It is almost never the one who asked the question. It is, time and again, the people standing nearby who cannot bear the silence on someone else's behalf. And that is exactly what happened here. Ananda, the Buddha's close attendant, the man who would spend decades at his side, hearing more of his teaching firsthand than anyone else alive, turned to him the moment Vacchagotta was gone and asked, with what the text let us read as genuine, almost wounded confusion, "Why didn't you answer him?" Not. You teach anatta non-self constantly. You have an answer. Why would you withhold it from someone who asked directly? The Buddha's explanation is one of the most psychologically precise moments in the entire canon, and it rewards being read slowly rather than rushed past. If I had said, yes, there is a self, he told Ananda, I would have confirmed the very view that traps Vacchagotta most deeply. The eternalist view, the belief in some fixed, permanent, unchanging soul that simply continues on regardless of what he does. That answer would have agreed with exactly what he already wanted to hear and done nothing to loosen his grip on it. But if I had said no, there is no self, the Buddha continued, a man already confused and already prone to extremes would have collapsed into a worse error still. The fear that nothing about him exists at all, that he is simply void, erased, meaningless. He would have gone from one trap directly into a deeper one. And worse, he might have believed that I had told him so, with all the authority that carries. Consider how much careful, individualized attention this explanation actually required. Attention most teachers, pressed by an impatient or frustrated questioner, would never have had the discipline to maintain. None. The Buddha was not weighing two abstract philosophical positions against each other in a vacuum. He was weighing two specific, predictable failure modes in one specific man's mind. Modes he had presumably observed across Vacchagotta's many previous visits and many previous questions, each one circling the same unresolved confusion from a slightly different angle. These two failure modes, eternalism, clinging to some fixed permanent self that simply continues unchanged, and annihilationism, the despairing collapse into believing nothing about a person continues or matters at all, recur constantly throughout this entire body of teaching as the two great ditches on either side of the middle way. The same middle way Kundana had first grasped back at Deer Park applied here not to indulgence and self-denial, but to the far more abstract terrain of metaphysical belief about the self. Most listeners, confronted with a question about whether they exist, tend to fall hard into one ditch or the other, rarely managing to walk the narrow ridge between them on their own. Vacchagotta's particular danger, the Buddha seems to have judged, leaned specifically toward whichever ditch a direct answer would have pushed him into, and rather than risk that push, even in the service of stating a technically correct doctrine, silence simply left him standing exactly where he already was, neither confirmed an error nor pushed toward a worse one. This pause is not empty. Pay attention to what's inside it. A complete, real-time diagnosis of exactly which mistake this particular person was most at risk of making, weighed instantly against the cost of correcting it with words that would have made things worse rather than better. Yes would have hurt him. No would have hurt him more, so neither was offered, because no honest verbal answer existed that wouldn't have done more damage than the silence itself. And this is the part that took Ananda, and takes most listeners, the first time they hear this story, far longer to fully absorb than the moment itself suggests. And it would have been so easy to imagine that the Buddha had simply ducked a hard metaphysical question, the way Malunkyaputta might have accused him of doing back in chapter 4. But this was a different kind of silence than that one, and Malunkyapputta's questions were redirected because they were the wrong questions entirely, irrelevant to the arrow in the wound. Vacchagotta's question was not irrelevant. Anatta sits at the very center of the teaching. It was the timing and the person and the very real risk that any direct answer would be misheard in exactly the way that caused the most harm that made silence the only response precise enough to do no damage. And hold that thought, because it is the seed of something that will keep returning across this entire story in increasingly difficult forms. Not every silence is the same silence. Some withhold an answer because the question is the wrong one. Some withhold an answer because the person asking is not yet able to hear any answer safely, no matter how true. Learning to tell these apart, learning in your own life, whether your own silence is protecting someone from harm or simply protecting yourself from the discomfort of speaking, is in many ways the entire skill this whole story is quietly trying to teach. Consider, too, how easily this exact same scene could have gone differently with a less careful teacher. A teacher eager to demonstrate doctrinal mastery might have seized the opportunity to deliver a tidy explanation of anatta, thus satisfied with having technically answered correctly regardless of whether the answer actually helped the person receiving it. A teacher eager to avoid controversy might have simply deflected with vague reassurance, offering neither the eternalist trap nor the annihilationist one, but also nothing of substance at all. What makes this moment distinctive and what makes Ananda's confusion so understandable in the first place is that the silence here was neither of these easier paths. It required holding simultaneously full knowledge of the correct doctrine and full awareness of exactly why delivering that doctrine in this specific moment, this specific man would have done harm rather than good. Ananda did not fully understand it that day. He carried the confusion with him, a faint, nagging sense that something important had happened that he hadn't yet earned the right to call wisdom rather than evasion. There is something almost tender in how the texts preserve this, not editing out the attendant's confusion to make the moment look cleaner than it was, not pretending Ananda simply nodded and understood everything instantly the way a flawless disciple in a more polished legend might have. He carried it for years, through teachings and travels and disputes, a small, unresolved itch of a question he had asked and not quite gotten an answer he could fully hold on to. He would carry that confusion for years, until a moment much further along in this story would finally, not fully resolve it for him. We will return to Ananda and to this exact unresolved discomfort later. For now, what matters is this. A question about the most fundamental nature of a human being was met with total, unbroken silence. And that silence, far from being an absence of teaching, was the most carefully calibrated teaching available in that moment. The hardest thing about it, then and now, is that it offers the listener nothing to hold on to. No verse to memorize, no doctrine to repeat. Just the discomfort of an unanswered question left open, exactly where it needed to stay. That discomfort, uncomfortable as it remains even now, 2,500 years removed from the original exchange, may be the entire point. A question this fundamental was never going to be settled by a sentence, however carefully chosen. And what it could be settled by, eventually, was the slow, patient work of a mind willing to sit with its own unanswered uncertainty long enough to discover on its own terms what no borrowed answer could ever have supplied as convincingly. Chapter 6. The Man Who Wanted a Miracle. From one disciple's quiet, private confusion, the story now turns to a much louder, much more public kind of doubt. Notice the deliberate widening of scale happening here, chapter after chapter, in exactly how visible each test of the discipline becomes. Vacchagotta's exchange happened privately, witnessed by Ananda alone, a confusion that stayed largely contained within the inner circle. What follows next will not stay contained at all. It will play out in public, with consequences for reputation that ripple far beyond any single conversation between a teacher and a single confused seeker. A monk named Sunakata had been with the community for some time. Like many who join any demanding path, his early enthusiasm had begun, gradually to curdle into something closer to disappointment. He had expected, it seems, more spectacle from this teacher than he was getting. And he wanted miracles. He wanted displays of supernatural power that would silence skeptics on the spot, the kind of unmistakable proof that would have made his own choice to follow this path look obviously, undeniably correct to everyone watching. There is something painfully recognizable in Sunakata's disappointment, if you sit with it honestly, rather than simply filing him away as a villain in someone else's story. He had given up something, status, comfort, perhaps relationships outside the order, to follow a teaching he believed would deliver extraordinary results. And what he found, day after day, was not extraordinary in the way he had imagined. It was ordinary discipline. Sitting, watching the breath, watching the mind, no fireworks. After enough days of ordinary practice without the payoff he had been promised, or had told himself he had been promised, his patience ran out. There is a particular kind of disappointment that arrives specifically from having built up too much expectation in advance. The gap between what a person convinces themselves they are owed and what reality is actually prepared to offer growing wider with every day that the promised transformation fails to arrive on schedule. Sunakata's frustration was not, in this light, simply a character flaw unique to him. It is recognizable in nearly anyone who has begun a demanding new discipline. a diet, a meditation practice, and a course of study, convinced that sufficient effort would produce a dramatic, visible turning point by a certain date, only to discover that real change, the kind that actually lasts, tends to arrive unannounced, slowly, in increments too small to notice on any single day, and entirely without the fireworks the impatient mind keeps demanding as proof that the effort is working at all. He went to the Buddha directly with his complaint. "Never perform any miracle for me," he said, more or less. "You never display superhuman power. You never explain in full detail, in a way I could verify and repeat, the ultimate origin of the world." There is a kind of consumer's logic embedded in Sunakata's complaint, worth naming because it is so recognizable in entirely modern contexts as well. He had, in effect, treated the teaching as a product that owed him a specific verifiable return on the investment of his years, and when that return did not arrive in the dramatic form he had specified for himself in advance, he experienced the absence not as a possible flaw in his own expectation, but as a broken promise on the part of the provider. This particular kind of disappointment, demanding proof on one's own predetermined terms, rather than remaining open to whatever form genuine progress might actually take, recurs constantly across human history in contexts that have nothing whatsoever to do with religious practice. Wait, the answer to this isn't coming the way you'd expect. The Buddha did not deny having unusual abilities. The texts elsewhere describe him performing demonstrations of stillness and perception that read, by any measure, as extraordinary. What he denied was something narrower and far more pointed, that any of that would actually do what Sunakata wanted it to do. "Even if I performed a miracle for you right now," he said, "in front of you and everyone watching, it would do nothing whatsoever to end your suffering or anyone else's. It would entertain. It would not liberate. And if I explained, in perfect, exhaustive detail, the absolute first origin of the universe, that explanation would also do nothing to end suffering. It would simply be one more fascinating fact, sitting beside countless other fascinating facts, none of which touch the actual problem we are here to solve." There is a precise, almost economic logic embedded in this distinction between entertainment and liberation, worth drawing out explicitly because it cuts against an intuition most people carry without examining it. We tend to assume, instinctively, that more impressive evidence should produce more durable conviction, that a genuine miracle, witnessed firsthand, ought to settle a doubt more permanently than years of ordinary, undramatic consistency ever could. The Buddha's response to Sunakata argues the opposite, and the rest of this story, particularly what unfolds later with King Pasenadi, will go on to demonstrate it concretely. A miracle produces at best temporary astonishment, an emotional state that fades on its own schedule regardless of how genuine the original display was. And it does nothing to address the actual mechanism producing suffering, the craving, the confusion, the grasping, because astonishment and liberation operate on completely different registers entirely, and confusing one for the other, however natural the confusion feels, leads precisely to the kind of disappointment Sunakata was about to experience. Sunakata was not satisfied. He left the order entirely, and afterward, by several accounts, spoke badly of his former teacher to anyone who would listen, calling him an ordinary man with no spiritual attainments beyond clever reasoning. Picture what this actually looked like on the ground. Small towns and marketplaces, where this kind of talk would have traveled fastest. A former insider, someone who had once worn the robe and sat among the community, now standing in public, telling merchants and farmers and curious passers-by that the teacher they had heard so much about was nothing special. A clever talker, nothing more. This is precisely the kind of accusation that, left unanswered, can do real and lasting damage to a community's reputation, especially in an era when reputation traveled by word of mouth alone, with no way to issue a correction that could reach as far as the original rumor had already spread. Here's the part nobody tells you in the simplified version of this story. The Buddha, hearing what Sunakata was saying about him in public, did not rush to defend his reputation. He did not send anyone to argue Sunakata down or correct the record point by point in the marketplace. He let the accusation stand uncontested in public for as long as it needed to stand. Most retellings rush past this moment because it is genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. A teacher's reputation openly attacked by a former student in public, and the response is simply more silent. And why would that be wisdom rather than weakness? Why would refusing to perform, refusing to defend, refusing to compete on the very terms Sunakata wanted count as anything other than conceding the argument? Hold that question and carry it forward with you, because it is not resolved here, not yet. This is in fact a loop deliberately left open. Does refusing to perform, refusing to argue, refusing to chase down every public accusation and correct it make a teacher weaker, or does it somehow make him harder to actually doubt in the long run, in a way that no successful miracle ever could? It is worth imagining what the alternative path might have looked like, the one the Buddha did not take. He could have summoned Sunakata back for a final demonstration, performing some feat of perception or stillness, specifically designed to humiliate the doubt out of him in front of witnesses. Such a display might well have silenced Sunakata's specific criticism immediately and decisively, but it would also have established, for every future skeptic who came afterward, that the correct response to doubt was an escalating contest of proof, that faith in this teaching could be won or lost through spectacle, the very premise the entire teaching was built to dismantle. Declining the contest, even at real short-term cost to his reputation, protected something the contest itself would have quietly destroyed. The principle that this path was never meant to be verified through performance in the first place. There is a Pali word worth holding on to here. Upekkha, equanimity, not indifference, not coldness, but a kind of even, unshaken steadiness that neither leans toward praise nor flinches from blame. And it is closely related to another idea threading through this entire story: vipassana, insight, the kind of seeing that looks clearly at what is actually happening rather than what one wishes were happening, or fears might be happening. Sunakata wanted spectacle because spectacle is easy to see and easy to believe. The Buddha was offering something that required the much harder, much slower work of looking directly at one's own mind, and no miracle, however impressive, could substitute for that looking. Consider, too, what upekkha costs the person practicing it in a moment like this one, because it is not the same as simply not caring. The Buddha's own community was watching a respected member walk away loudly criticizing him in public, and remaining steady through that requires actively choosing not to let an injury to reputation become an injury to one's own settled mind. A far harder discipline than the simple absence of feeling, and a discipline that has to be renewed moment by moment, rather than achieved once and kept permanently. The crowd around the Buddha in those weeks, by several accounts, was uneasy. A respected member of the community had left loudly, publicly, with sharp words on his way out, and the man at the center of it all said almost nothing in his own defense. The quiet here is doing more work than words could, even if it would take time. Chapters, in fact, still ahead of us in this story, before that work became visible to the people watching it happen. It is worth imagining what it would have actually felt like to be one of the newer monks in the community during this exact stretch of weeks, having joined relatively recently, watching a senior member depart with public denunciations and observing the founder's apparent unwillingness to respond. Doubt in that position would have been entirely understandable, and a newer member has not yet accumulated the years of direct personal observation that eventually steadied Pasanati's trust. He has only this single uncomfortable moment, this single unanswered accusation, sitting unresolved in front of him, with no guarantee of how it would eventually be settled. If a teacher you trusted were publicly criticized by someone who used to follow them, and they chose not to defend themselves, would that make you trust them more or less? Hold that question through the next few chapters. We are coming back to it, and the answer will surprise you. Chapter 7. Which questions a king gets answered centuries pass, and the pattern outlives the man who first practiced it. This is, in fact, the first time in the entire story that the action shifts away from the Buddha's own lifetime entirely. Every chapter so far has stayed within the roughly 45 years between the awakening at Bodh Gaya and the death at Kushinagar. What follows briefly steps outside that window deliberately, and to demonstrate something the rest of the story alone could not show on its own. Whether the discipline being traced here actually outlived the single man who first practiced it, or whether it depended all along on his particular presence to function at all. Long after the Buddha's death, in a kingdom shaped by the Greek conquests of Alexander the Great and ruled by a Hellenistic king named Menander, known in the Indian sources as Milinda, a Buddhist monk named Nagasena was summoned for a debate the king fully expected to win. Milinda was famous for dismantling religious teachers in argument, and he came prepared with exactly the kind of metaphysical traps that had once cornered Buddha and Vacchagotta. Questions about the self, about identity, about what precisely continues from one moment to the next if nothing permanent exists at all. It is worth picturing the strangeness of this encounter for a moment, because it says something about how far this teaching had already traveled by the time it reached Melinda's court. A Greek-descended king, ruling territory that had once belonged to one of history's most famous Macedonian conquerors, sitting in a debate hall in northwestern India. Testing the logical rigor of a teaching that had begun centuries earlier on a riverbank in Magadha, carried east and west by monks walking from village to village exactly the way the Buddha himself once had. And the chariot rolling forward through history had already passed through more hands, more languages, more kingdoms than its first 5 passengers at Deer Park could ever have imagined. And consider what this kind of cultural distance required of the teaching itself in order to survive the journey intact. A method built specifically around reading each individual listener's particular confusion. Each individual listener's particular dust could easily have calcified over centuries and across cultures, a rigid set of fixed answers handed down by rote, the very opposite of what Sahampati's lotus pond had originally described. That it did not calcify, that a monk trained in this tradition could still meet a skeptical Greek-descended king on his own argumentative terms and adapt the teaching's core insight into an entirely new logical form. The chariot, rather than the arrow or the lotus, suggests the method itself rather than any single fixed formulation of it had survived the journey. What traveled from Magadha to Melinda's court was not a script to be recited. It was a discipline of attention, capable of producing new images suited to new audiences as needed. He asked Nagasena a question that sounds almost playful on the surface and is, underneath, devastating. By what name should I call you? Nagasena answered that Nagasena was simply a convenient label, a designation with no permanent independent self corresponding to it. Melinda pounced immediately. Then, who is speaking to me right now? Who eats? Who walks? Who debates me? If there is no Nagasena, there is no one here for me to be addressing at all. This is where it gets remarkable, where the lessons of every prior chapter in this story finally crystallize into a tool sharp enough to use in open debate. Nagasena did not retreat into silence here. He answered, but he answered with a question of his own, a famous chariot analogy that has outlived both men by nearly 2,000 years. He asked the king, "Is the chariot you arrived in identical to its wheels?" "No." "Is it identical to its axle?" "No." "Its frame, its yoke, its reins?" "No." "Now each in turn." "Then where," Nagasena asked, "is the chariot at all, if no single part of it, examined alone, is the chariot itself?" Watch how carefully Nagasena builds this argument, piece by piece, refusing to let the king escape into vagueness at any point along the way. Each question demands a specific concrete answer about a specific concrete part of an object the king had just ridden in himself that very afternoon, so there could be no retreat into abstraction. no claiming the analogy didn't quite apply to his actual experience. By the time the full inventory of parts was exhausted, Melinda had nowhere left to stand except the conclusion Nagasena had been steering him toward from the very first question. Melinda, cornered by his own logic, admitted that chariot is simply the name given to the parts working together in a particular arrangement, a useful, real functioning label, even though no single piece of it deserves the name alone. So too, Nagasena said, Nagasena, a useful, real functioning name for a particular arrangement of body and mind continuously changing with no fixed, separate self underneath it. Exactly the teaching of anatta that the Buddha had once refused to confirm or deny aloud to Vacchagotta, now demonstrated, argued, defended, and won openly in front of a king. Notice the difference, because it is the entire point of this chapter. The same teaching that once required total silence to protect a confused, vulnerable man from misunderstanding it in the worst possible direction could, centuries later, be argued in full, vigorous public detail in front of a sharp, skeptical king, because the situation, the listener, and the stakes were entirely different. And Melinda was not at risk of falling into eternalism or annihilationism the way Vacchagotta had been. He was a trained debater looking for a worthy intellectual opponent, and he got one. It is worth considering, too, what would have happened had Nagasena instead chosen to meet Melinda's question with the same total silence the Buddha had once offered Vacchagotta. A king accustomed to dismantling religious teachers in argument, not confronted with silence instead of engagement, would almost certainly have interpreted that silence not as wisdom but as defeat, as evidence that the teaching simply had no answer capable of withstanding scrutiny. And the very same response that protected a confused wanderer from a worse error would, in this entirely different context, have actively damaged the teaching's credibility in front of an audience fully capable of receiving and benefiting from a rigorous answer. Context, this story keeps insisting, is not a minor adjustment around the edges of the method. It is the entire method. This is the part most people get wrong about everything we've covered so far in this story. Silence was never the rule. Silence was never simply what wise teachers do instead of answering. The actual rule, none, threaded through every single example so far, is far more demanding than that. Answer when answering serves the listener. Redirect when the question itself is the wrong one. And stay silent only when any answer, true or false, would do more harm in that specific mind at that specific moment than no answer at all. It is worth being explicit about why this distinction matters so much, especially for anyone tempted to walk away from this story having learned only the wise stay quiet. That simplified version, however appealing it might sound, would have been useless to Nagasena in this exact debate hall, facing a king who needed precision and rigor, not contemplative silence. It would have been equally useless to the 5 ascetics at Deer Park, who needed clear doctrine stated plainly, not withheld answers dressed up as profundity. The actual skill this story has been tracing from its very first chapter is harder and less quotable than stay silent. It is the ongoing, case-by-case discernment of which tool a given moment actually calls for, with silence simply being one tool among several reserved specifically for the situations where it and only it will do. There is a Pali word that holds all of this together, used throughout these texts to describe the teaching itself in its broadest sense, Dhamma, the truth of how things actually are, the natural law beneath appearances, and also, more practically, the body of teaching the Buddha left behind to point toward that truth. Dhamma was never reducible to a fixed set of sentences to be recited unchanged in every circumstance. It was a living, responsive thing, calibrated new each time to the particular dust covering each particular pair of eyes, exactly as Sahampati had described it, all the way back at the very beginning of this story. And there is one more figure worth naming here, less famous than Nagasena, but quietly essential to understanding why this entire tradition survived its founder's death without collapsing into chaos. A monk named Upali, recognized even during the Buddha's lifetime as the foremost authority on the Vinaya, the body of monastic discipline governing exactly how, when, and under what circumstances a monk may speak, act, and conduct himself within the community. Before his ordination, Upali had worked as a barber to the Buddha's own royal relatives, a detail the early community preserved deliberately, rather than quietly omitting, since it demonstrated that mastery of discipline and precision of speech had nothing to do with the rank a person was born into. Upali's entire life's work was devoted to a single, unglamorous question that runs underneath every chapter of this story without ever quite being named outright. What does disciplined, careful speech actually require in practice, day after day, long after the dramatic confrontations are over and only the ordinary business of living together remains? It is worth noting that, after the Buddha's death, it was Upali who was specifically called upon to recite and help preserve the entire body of monastic discipline at the very first council convened to gather and authenticate the teachings before they could drift, scatter, or be misremembered across a community no longer anchored by a single living teacher's direct correction. A man once defined by the lowliness of his original profession had become, by the end of his life, one of the small handful of people entrusted with the precise word-for-word preservation of exactly the kind of careful, deliberate speech this entire story has been examining, from a riverbank in Magadha all the way to a debate hall ruled by a Greek-descended king. The chariot rolls on. The wheels are not the chariot. None. The Buddha is not reducible to any single answer he gave or any single silence he kept. What remains centuries later, in a debate hall between a Greek king and an Indian monk, is the arrangement itself, still functioning, still useful, still capable of clearing the dust from a pair of eyes sharp enough, finally, to ask the right question. Milinda's later reputation, preserved in both Greek and Indian sources, describes a king who continued to govern his territories with notable fairness for the era, and who is remembered in some traditions as having eventually died respected by his subjects to an unusual degree, his ashes reportedly divided among several cities, each eager to claim a portion of his memory, an honor more typically reserved in the ancient world for a figure considered exceptionally beloved rather than merely powerful. And whatever this single debate with Nagasena actually changed in Milinda's own life, it apparently did not produce a convert who abandoned his throne or his prior commitments. It produced something perhaps more interesting still, a ruler who carried at least one genuinely examined idea about the nature of identity into the ordinary, unglamorous business of governing for the remainder of his reign. Chapter 8. The cousin who wanted the throne back now to the founding years, to a threat that came not from a skeptical wanderer or a disappointed former student, but from inside the Buddha's own family, with stakes higher than any single debate could carry. Every threat encountered so far in this story has come from outside the immediate circle of trust. A curious wanderer, a disillusioned monk, a foreign king testing the rigor of an unfamiliar teaching. What follows breaks that pattern decisively, and the break matters. Betrayal from within a family, from someone who shares both blood and decades of shared history. None tests a different kind of steadiness than skepticism from a stranger ever could, because it carries with it the particular ache of recognizing danger in a face that should, by every ordinary expectation, have been safe. Devadatta was the Buddha's cousin, a man of genuine ability who had joined the order and, by several accounts, developed real skill in meditation and discipline. For years he served capably within the community, respected by many, trusted with responsibility, the kind of senior monk newer disciples might have looked to as a model. But ability and ambition are not the same thing, and somewhere along the way, Devadatta's ambition outgrew what the role of respected senior monk could satisfy. And the text suggests the breaking point came gradually rather than all at once. A slow accumulation of resentment at standing always one step behind a cousin whose reputation had, by this point in the Buddha's life, not spread across kingdoms, attracting the patronage of kings and wealthy merchants alike. Devadatta had power, respect, skill. What he did not have was the singular position at the very top. The longer he watched that position remain permanently out of reach, the more it seems to have consumed him. There is a recognizable, almost universal shape to this kind of slow corrosion, one that has nothing particularly exotic about it despite the ancient setting. Two people, close from childhood, pursue what looks, for a long stretch of years, like the same path with similar dedication. One of them, through some combination of capacity, circumstance, and timing that the other cannot fully account for, ends up occupying a position the second person had quietly assumed all along was equally within his own reach. The resentment that follows rarely announces itself honestly, even to the person feeling it. It dresses itself in the language of legitimate concern, about the community's future, about the aging leader's fitness to continue, about the genuine needs of an organization that Devadatta could tell himself simply needed fresh leadership. The proposal to take over arrived wrapped in exactly this kind of plausible, even reasonable-sounding justification, the way ambition so often does when it has had years to rehearse its own cover story. He approached the Buddha directly, late in the Buddha's life, with a proposal dressed up as concern. "The teacher is aging," he said in essence. The community would benefit from a younger leader, with more energy to guide it forward. "Let me take over leadership of the order." The Buddha refused, not with anger, not with a lecture about ambition, simply a flat, calm refusal, the kind that leaves no opening for negotiation. "I would not hand over leadership of this community even to Sariputta or Moggallana, two of my most accomplished and trusted disciples," he is recorded as saying. "How much less to you? This is not cowardice. This is not passivity. This is not surrender dressed up as patience." What followed this refusal was, by multiple accounts, a sustained campaign by Devadatta to undermine and ultimately end the Buddha's life, conspiring with a hostile prince, allegedly arranging for an elephant to be driven, enraged, into the Buddha's path, allegedly hurling a boulder toward him from a height, allegedly attempting to split the monastic community itself by recruiting a faction of monks loyal to a stricter, separate set of rules he proposed in direct competition. And through all of it, the Buddha's recorded responses are strikingly consistent in their refusal to escalate. The elephant in the most famous version of the story, not trample him. Accounts describe the great animal calming the moment it drew near, the Buddha standing entirely still, neither retreating nor striking out, simply present, unthreatened, ill. The danger dissolved on its own. Picture the scene as the surrounding crowd must have witnessed it. A charging elephant, trained or provoked specifically for this purpose, bearing down on a single unmoving man, while disciples and onlookers scattered in every direction, screaming for him to run. And a figure who simply did not move, who let the full weight of that approaching danger arrive and pass through him rather than around him, the way a deeply rooted tree lets a storm pass over its branches without uprooting it. When the boulder allegedly fell, deflected by a chance outcropping of rock, drawing only blood from his foot rather than ending his life, there is no record of him afterward demanding punishment, organizing retaliation, or even speaking publicly against Devadatta with any real heat. It is worth being honest about how differently this episode could have unfolded had even a flicker of fear crossed his face in that first instant. Animals respond, and often with great sensitivity, to the emotional state radiating from the creatures around them. An elephant already agitated enough to be charging in the first place might well have read panic in a fleeing target as confirmation that danger was, in fact, present and worth pursuing. And the stillness that calmed the animal was not simply a moral virtue on display for the benefit of onlookers. It may have been, quite literally, the only response capable of producing the outcome that actually followed. Nod. There's one more thing worth sitting with here, something most retellings of the Devadatta story skip past too quickly. When Devadatta did succeed temporarily in splitting off a faction of monks to follow his own stricter rules, the Buddha did not chase after them with arguments to win them back by force of rhetoric. He sent two of his most trusted disciples, Sariputta and Moggallana, quietly, patiently, not to simply be present among the breakaway group, not to argue, but to remind gently of what they had originally understood and chosen. Most of the defectors returned on their own, not because anyone outdebated them, but because the patient presence of two respected, trusted figures did more than any confrontation could have. There is a particular irony worth noticing in how this resolution unfolded, an irony that would have been visible to anyone watching closely at the time. Devadatta had built his entire breakaway movement on the claim that the Buddha's existing rules were too lenient. That genuine spiritual seriousness demanded stricter, more visibly austere practice. He had, in effect, accused his cousin of exactly the kind of compromise that the original 5 ascetics at Deer Park had once accused the newly recovered Gautama of making, all the way back in Chapter 3, when he accepted that first bowl of rice milk. The same accusation, too soft, too compromising, not rigorous enough, had now been leveled twice across this story. Once by genuine confused friends who later became his first disciples, and once by a genuinely ambitious rival who used the accusation as a pretext for seizing power. The Buddha's response to both was, notably, not identical in its essential shape. Neither defensive argument nor capitulation to the accusation's terms, but simply continuing to teach and embody the middle way exactly as he understood it, trusting that consistency, sustained long enough, would outlast both honest confusion and dishonest ambition alike. There is a Pali word for the quality on display throughout this entire chapter, one we have brushed against before, but that deserves its own full weight here. Khanti, forbearance, not the passive, helpless endurance the English word patience sometimes implies, but an active, chosen, not strength requiring restraint, the deliberate decision not to strike back when striking back would be not only possible, but by any ordinary measure, justified. It is worth being precise about what Khanti is not, and because the distinction matters for understanding why this entire chapter reads as strength rather than weakness. It is not the suppression of anger through sheer denial, pretending no hostile feeling arose at all. None. The texts do not describe the Buddha as numb to the danger Devadatta posed, or unaware of the betrayal involved in a cousin actively conspiring against his life. None. What they describe is something harder than either suppression or retaliation. A clear-eyed registering of the threat, followed by a deliberate choice not to let that registering dictate an escalating response. And this is where Ananda's long confusion, planted all the way back when Vacchagotta walked away from an unanswered question, finally begins to resolve. Ananda had watched, over the years since that earlier moment, not silence after silence that he had not fully understood. Answers withheld, confrontations not escalated, accusations not corrected, but watching his teacher stand unmoving in front of a charging elephant. Now, watching him decline to retaliate against a cousin actively trying to end his life, something in Ananda's understanding finally clicked into place that no explanation alone had managed to provide. This was not weakness wearing the costume of wisdom. This was the hardest possible form of strength, the kind that has every justification to react and chooses instead not to. What happens next explains everything that came before it, and it explains something further still, something that connects directly back to Sunakata's public accusations in Chapter 6, where we left an open question hanging. Does refusing to defend yourself make you weaker, or does it make you, in the long run, harder to actually doubt? Watching Devadatta's campaign ultimately collapse, Not through argument, not through counterattack, but through its own internal instability and the patient, undramatic presence of people who simply continued behaving as they always had. Gives us the answer that question was waiting for. Performance can be matched, countered, outdone. Steadiness, sustained long enough under real pressure, eventually becomes its own kind of proof that no single act of spectacle could ever provide. And it is worth being precise about exactly what kind of proof this actually is, because it differs in an important way from the kind of proof a single dramatic vindication might offer. Steadiness sustained under pressure does not prove in any single moment that a person's claims are correct. What it proves, slowly and cumulatively, is that the person making those claims is not performing, that whatever they say in calm circumstances is also what they do under genuine threat, with nothing held back for a more convenient moment. That kind of proof cannot be staged on demand, cannot be summoned for a single dramatic occasion, and cannot, crucially, be faked for very long by anyone whose underlying composure is not genuine. This is precisely why it took years of observation, rather than a single encounter, for someone like Pasanadi to fully trust it. There is a measurable and physical dimension to this kind of restraint worth pausing on before we move forward, because it is not only an ancient teaching, it shows up in modern neuroscience as well. And researchers studying the brain's response to provocation have found that the impulse toward an immediate defensive reaction originates largely in older, faster structures deep in the brain, while the capacity to pause, to let a few seconds pass before responding, allows slower, more deliberate regions associated with weighing consequences, with genuine understanding of another person's state of mind, time to actually engage. This pause and engage process is not instantaneous, and that delay is precisely the point. The fast defensive system can produce a reaction in a fraction of a second, fast enough to feel involuntary, fast enough to convince the person reacting that no real choice was ever available. The slower system requires, by comparison, a small eternity, perhaps only a handful of seconds. But a handful of seconds is an enormous amount of time when measured against the speed of provocation itself. Building the capacity to survive that gap, not tolerate the discomfort of not reacting immediately while the slower system catches up, is in this light not a mystical attainment reserved for awakened beings alone. It is a trainable skill, the same skill the Buddha appears to have cultivated across decades of practice, made visible in a single dramatic test involving an elephant, rather than an irritable colleague or a difficult conversation at the dinner table. The cost of skipping that pause is well documented. People who respond immediately to provocation, study after study shows, and to escalate conflict and regret their words far more often than people who allow even a brief delay before speaking. The elephant that calmed before the Buddha rather than trampling him is, in this light, almost a perfect physical metaphor for what happens inside a single human nervous system every time it is given the chance to pause before reacting. The charge slows, and what looked, a moment before, like an unstoppable collision becomes, instead, simply a presence standing still, waiting to see what is actually needed. If you've ever had to stay calm in front of someone actively trying to provoke you, you already know how much harder that stillness is to hold than any clever response would have been. That's worth remembering as we move forward, because the hardest tests of this pattern are still ahead of us. And what this chapter has shown, more than any single dramatic confrontation within it, is that the discipline this story keeps tracing is not a personality trait some people simply happen to be born with, while others are not. It is closer to a trained capacity, visible in its clearest form precisely when the provocation is greatest. An elephant charging, a boulder falling, a cousin actively plotting murder. And precisely because the provocation is greatest, capable of demonstrating, beyond any reasonable doubt, that what looked like calm was never the absence of feeling, but the presence of something stronger than the feeling trying to override it. There is encouragement worth taking from this framing. For anyone who has ever doubted their own capacity to remain steady under real pressure, if this discipline were simply an inborn temperament, it would offer little use to anyone not lucky enough to have been born with it. Framed instead as a trained capacity, built across years of deliberate practice, exactly the way the Buddha's own years of searching had built the foundation for everything that followed. It becomes something available, at least in principle, to anyone willing to put in comparable years of their own. Chapter 9. King who stopped asking for proof. From a rival inside the order, the story now turns outward, to a king watching from a careful distance, weighing everything he saw before deciding whether to trust any of it. Notice the contrast in proximity between these two relationships, set side by side. Devadatta was as close as family can be, sharing childhood and blood and decades of shared training, and that closeness produced betrayal. Pasanati began as a stranger, a skeptical outsider with every institutional incentive to dismiss this teacher as one more performer seeking royal patronage. And that distance paradoxically gave him room to observe with a clarity unclouded by any prior emotional investment. Sometimes the people who know us least end up seeing us most accurately, simply because they have nothing at stake in seeing us any particular way. King Pasenadi of Kosala was one of the most powerful rulers of his time, and like most powerful rulers, he had spent his reign surrounded by people telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. Court life, by its nature, rewards flattery and punishes honesty, and a man in Pasenadi's position would have grown accustomed, over years of rule, to weighing every word spoken to him against the strong likelihood that it had been shaped, consciously or not, by the speaker's hope of gaining something from him. He had met many religious teachers, listened to many claims of spiritual attainment, and grown, understandably, skeptical of nearly all of them. When he first encountered the Buddha, by several accounts, he came not as a devoted seeker, but as a man testing whether this teacher, like so many before him, would eventually ask something of him or perform something for him, or otherwise reveal himself as one more practiced operator working an angle. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with great power, the loneliness of never quite knowing whether anyone around you is being honest, and it is worth holding that loneliness in mind as the backdrop to everything that follows in this chapter. Pasenadi was not simply curious about religious doctrine. He was, in a very real sense, starving for a single relationship in his adult life that was not, on some level, transactional. This particular kind of isolation rarely receives the sympathy it might otherwise deserve, precisely because it belongs to people whose circumstances look from the outside like the furthest thing imaginable from genuine hardship. A king surrounded by wealth, by servants, by every comfort a kingdom could provide, and asking for nothing more than one honest conversation can sound almost absurd as a complaint when set beside the suffering this story has already traced in other chapters: a grieving grandmother, a guilt-stricken patricide, none fleeing a forest predator. And yet loneliness of this particular kind, the loneliness of never being certain whether anyone around you sees you clearly or merely sees what your position can offer them, is its own genuine form of suffering, however differently dressed from the others this story has examined. What Pasenadi found, over repeated visits, was something he had apparently never encountered before. A teacher entirely uninterested in impressing him. He brought questions about violence, about the moral weight of ruling a kingdom that sometimes required war, about how a man responsible for thousands of lives could reconcile that responsibility with any teaching about compassion and non-harm. He expected, perhaps, the kind of answer rulers usually receive: flattering justification, or alternatively, dramatic condemnation designed to provoke guilt and donations in equal measure. Both of these expected responses, it is worth noting, would have served the speaker's own interests at least as much as the king's actual understanding. Flattery secures continued royal favor. Dramatic condemnation paradoxically, often secures the same thing, since guilt-stricken patrons frequently become the most generous ones, eager to atone through donation for whatever wrong they have just been made to feel freshly ashamed of. A teacher genuinely indifferent to securing royal favor through either route was, in Pasenadi's experience up to that point, simply not a category of person he had previously encountered. Instead, he got patient, careful, undramatic reasoning. The Buddha did not tell him that war was always wrong in every circumstance, nor did he tell him that his violence was justified because he was a king. He spoke instead about the root causes beneath violence, about moha, delusion, the confused, distorted seeing that makes harming another person seem like the only available option, and about samsara, a long wheel of cause and effect in which every act of harm sets in motion consequences that return, eventually, to the one who caused them, in this life or beyond it. He gave Pasenadi something to think with, rather than something to feel guilty or comfortable about on command. Notice the precision of this approach, especially when set against the two extremes a lesser teacher might have offered a powerful patron. Easy condemnation would have cost the Buddha nothing personally, and might even have flattered his own followers, eager to hear a king scolded for the violence kings so often commit. As the absolution would have secured Pasenadi's continued patronage and protection, an obvious practical benefit for a growing religious community that depended in part on royal goodwill. The Buddha offered neither. He offered a framework Pasenadi would have to apply to his own specific decisions again and again for the rest of his reign, harder than either flattery or condemnation, and far more likely to actually change how the king governed. There is another exchange between the two men, recorded separately, that shows this same pattern applied to a much more intimate concern than statecraft. Pasenadi once arrived visibly troubled after learning that his newborn daughter, rather than the son he had hoped for, would inherit no formal claim to rule under the customs of his kingdom. He came expecting perhaps, consolation or at minimum agreement that a daughter was a disappointment worth grieving. Instead, he was told, in essence, that a daughter could grow to surpass a son in wisdom and virtue, and that the king's own disappointment said more about the limits of his expectations than about any actual deficiency in the child herself. Once again, no flattery, no easy agreement with the assumption the king had walked in carrying. Just a quiet redirection toward a truer way of seeing the situation in front of him. The same instinct, scaled down from questions of war and empire to the far more personal question of how a father should regard his own child. Here's the part that took the king himself years to fully recognize, by his own later admission recorded in the texts. He trusted this teacher specifically because the teacher never tried to win his trust through display. Other religious figures Pasenadi had met would perform, would flatter, would predict favorable outcomes for his reign in exchange for patronage. This one simply spoke the truth as he saw it, declined to flatter, declined to perform, and let Pasenadi take it or leave it. This is exactly where the open loop planted back in chapter 6 finally resolves. Sunakata had left the order loudly, publicly, specifically because the Buddha refused to perform miracles or explain cosmic origins on demand, refused, in other words, to prove himself in the way Sunakata wanted proof. We left hanging the question of whether that refusal made him weaker or, eventually, harder to doubt. Here is the answer, embodied in a king with every resource in the world to seek out the most impressive performer available, who instead settled, over years of careful observation, on the one teacher who had never once tried to impress him. The text gives us a striking moment late in their relationship. Pasenadi, reflecting on why he had come to trust this teacher so completely, lists the very absence of performance as the reason. He notes that other ascetics he has met seem to age poorly under the hardship of their practice. Thin, sickly, anxious, while this one, after decades of teaching and travel, remains serene, clear-eyed, settled. Not a miracle, just consistency observed patiently over years, which turned out to be more persuasive than any single dramatic display could ever have been. It is worth noticing how unusual this particular form of evidence actually is, not against everything else Pasenadi would have had available to him as a measure of spiritual authenticity in his era. He could have asked for visions, for prophecies, for displays of supernatural power, not all of which other teachers of the time apparently offered freely to whoever wished to be impressed. Instead, the evidence that ultimately convinced a deeply skeptical king was something almost embarrassingly mundane. A man who looked the same, sounded the same, and behaved the same, whether surrounded by royal attendants or sitting alone with a handful of monks in a forest. No, there is a lesson buried in Pasenadi's own choice of evidence here, one easy to miss amid the grandeur of kings and ascetics. The most reliable proof of anyone's character is rarely found in their most dramatic, most observed moments. It is found in the thousands of small, unwatched moments that added together across enough years simply cannot be faked. This is where it gets remarkable if you sit with the shape of it. A king did not become convinced because the Buddha won an argument, performed a miracle, or made an emotionally compelling appeal. He became convinced by the simple, nothing, cumulative weight of someone behaving the same way in private as in public, the same way when unwatched as when surrounded by crowds, for years on end, with nothing to gain from maintaining the performance if it had been one. None. Authority, it turns out, is not the same thing as proof. Proof can be staged. Authority, the kind that survives years of close royal scrutiny, generally cannot. And the stakes here have widened considerably from where this story began. A confused monk's private question in Chapter 5 has, by this point, grown into the trust of a king governing a kingdom, moving the consequences of this entire pattern of silence and selective speech from the scale of one person's understanding to the scale of how an entire society's most powerful man chooses to govern. We are no longer simply asking what one teacher should say to one questioner. We are watching what that same discipline of speech can do when applied, patiently, over years, to the hardest job most people will ever encounter, the responsibility of power itself. It is worth noting, too, what this teaches about the limits of impatience in building any kind of trust worth having. Pasenadi's confidence did not arrive after a single impressive conversation. It accumulated visit after visit, year after year, the way sediment slowly builds a riverbank, invisible in any single moment, undeniable when measured across enough time. A teacher hoping to win a skeptical king's trust quickly through one dazzling display would very likely have failed, the same way Sunakata's demand for instant miracles had always been doomed to disappoint him. And what worked on Pasenadi was the opposite of speed, years of being consistently exactly the same person whether watched closely or not at all. There is a final detail in the recorded relationship between these two men worth carrying forward into the chapters still ahead. By the end of his reign, Pasenadi is said to have remarked that he and the Buddha, despite the vast difference in their stations, had grown old together as something close to equals in friendship. An extraordinary claim for a king to make about anyone, let alone a wandering teacher with no formal political standing whatsoever. Whatever else this single friendship demonstrates, it demonstrates that the patient, undramatic discipline this story has been tracing was never merely a clever technique for managing difficult people. It was, when sustained long enough, capable of producing something as rare and as valuable as genuine friendship between a king and the one person in his life who had never once tried to flatter him into it. Chapter 10. What a grandmother asks for from a king's question about the morality of war. The story now turns to something far smaller in scale and, in its way, far harder to sit with. One grandmother, one dead child, one question that has no answer capable of touching the size of the grief that produced it. The scale of this story has been steadily widening for several chapters now. From one confused monk to a public dispute, to a debating king, to the fate of an entire community threatened from within, to the conscience of a ruling monarch. Here, deliberately, the scale contracts again, all the way back down to the smallest possible unit. One person, one loss, one question asked in a single moment of private devastation. The widening and narrowing is not accidental. This story keeps testing whether the same underlying discipline holds at every scale, from the most intimate grief to the most public conflict, and it would fail as a demonstration if it only ever showed the pattern working at the grandest, most dramatic register. And Vacchagotta was among the most devoted and respected lay followers in the entire community, known for generosity, for wisdom, for a steadiness that had earned her admiration across the region. She had funded the construction of monasteries, hosted countless monks and nuns in her own home, and had, by the time of this story, spent decades practicing exactly the kind of reflection on impermanence that the Buddha's teaching asks of every serious follower. If anyone might have seemed, on paper, prepared for loss, it would have been her. None of that steadiness prepared her for the death of her grandchild, a death sudden enough and cruel enough in its particulars that even a woman with decades of practice found herself undone by it. There is something worth sitting with in this alone, before the story even reaches what the Buddha said to her. The fact that decades of sincere, devoted practice did not make Vacchagotta immune to grief, not give her some shortcut around the raw physical devastation of losing a child she loved. The teaching never promised that. What it promises, and what this particular episode goes on to demonstrate with unusual clarity, is something narrower and, in its way, more honest. Not protection from grief, but a way of eventually moving through it that does not require pretending it never happened or never mattered. This distinction matters enormously for anyone tempted to measure their own grief against their own spiritual or psychological maturity, assuming that sufficient inner work should eventually produce something close to immunity from loss. Vacchagotta's example argues directly against that assumption. Decades of generosity, of careful practice, of demonstrated wisdom across a long and well-documented life did nothing to soften the actual blow when it finally arrived. What changed because of those decades was not whether the grief would come, but what resources she would have available once it did. A community that knew her, a teacher willing to meet her exactly where she stood rather than where her reputation suggested she ought to be standing, and a framework, however incomplete it felt in that first unbearable moment, that she could eventually grow back into using once the rawest stage of loss had passed. She came to the Buddha not composed, not philosophical, but simply broken open by loss the way grief breaks anyone open regardless of how much wisdom they have accumulated beforehand. She wanted to know why. Why this child? Why now? Owned. Why a death so senseless that no amount of teaching about impermanence had prepared her for the actual physical fact of it. The Buddha did not offer her a philosophical explanation. He did not walk her, point by point, through the doctrine of impermanence, as though grief were a math problem that simply needed the correct formula applied to it. What he offered instead, gently, was almost the opposite of an explanation. He asked her how many people across how many lifetimes of being born again and again into this world she imagined she had loved and lost before this single loss in front of her now. He asked her to consider the sheer scale of grief that exists, has always existed, in every family, in every village, in every single moment of human history happening somewhere on earth right now, at the very moment of her own particular sorrow. Notice the form this takes. A question, not an answer, offered back to a woman who had come asking a question of her own. And this is itself a quieter echo of the pattern this entire story has been tracing since the very first chapter. Meeting someone's demand for certainty not with a counter-certainty of equal weight, but with an invitation to look more carefully at the actual shape of what they were facing. Vacchagotta had asked why. She received instead A question that asked her to widen her gaze rather than narrow it onto an answer that, not even if supplied, would not have actually lessened what she was carrying. This is not the kind of comfort most people expect, and if you're hearing it for the first time, it might not sound like comfort at all. It can sound, at first, almost cold, as if her specific, irreplaceable grandchild were being folded into a vast, anonymous statistic of human loss in general. But that is not quite what was happening. Karuna, compassion, in this teaching, not primarily about saying the soothing thing in the moment. It is about helping someone see clearly enough to eventually find their own way through, even when seeing clearly at first hurts more than comforting lies would. There is a meaningful difference worth dwelling on between widening someone's grief into meaninglessness and widening it into context. The Buddha was not suggesting Vacchagotta's grandchild mattered less because countless others had also been lost and mourned throughout history. He was offering her a way to recognize that her grief, however unbearable, was not evidence that the universe had singled her out for special cruelty. A belief that, left unexamined, often deepens suffering by adding isolation on top of loss. Seeing her sorrow as part of a vast shared human condition, rather than a uniquely personal curse, does not make the sorrow disappear, but it can, slowly, remove one layer of the burden. The layer that insists this should not be happening to me in particular. And the text does not record Vacchagotta leaving that conversation healed, transformed, at peace. It records something quieter and in its way more honest. She carried the question with her, unresolved in any tidy sense. The explanation she wanted never quite delivered in the form she had hoped for. An explanation was withheld here, not callously, not because none existed, but because no explanation, however true, would have actually touched the wound the way she needed it touched. Was that mercy? Or was it, in some sense, the Buddha himself might have acknowledged, simply the limits of what words can do in the face of a loss this size? Hold that open question because we have seen it before in this story in different clothing. The arrow Malunkyaputta wanted explained could be set aside because explaining it would not have removed it. But grief is not quite the same as a metaphysical question about the universe's origin. Grief has already removed something. The explanation isn't blocking treatment. The loss has already happened. What, then, was withheld for, if not to spare her additional harm from an unhelpful answer? It is worth noting that a closely related episode involving another grieving mother, Kisa Gotami, follows a similar shape in the broader tradition surrounding these events. A mother carrying her dead child from house to house, asking for medicine to revive him, eventually being told gently not to find a household that had never experienced death and bring back a mustard seed from it. She searched every house in the village and found in every single one someone who had lost a parent, a child, a sibling, a spouse, and returned, finally, not with a mustard seed, but with the understanding that her loss, however singular it felt to her, was woven into the same fabric every household around her had also already survived. And the lesson offered to Vacchagotta belongs to this same family of response, not an explanation that erases grief, but a widening of vision that places grief, eventually, within a shared human inheritance large enough to be survivable. And there is a particular cleverness embedded in sending Kisa Gotami out to search for something she would never actually find, rather than simply telling her directly what searching would teach her. Had she been told outright that every household had also lost someone, the statement might well have bounced off the particular all-consuming insularity grief tends to produce. The conviction, however irrational, that one's own loss is uniquely unbearable in a way no one else's could possibly be. Sending her to discover this fact herself, door by door, conversation by conversation, allowed the lesson to arrive as her own lived experience rather than as someone else's second-hand assertion. and lived experience. This story has shown again and again tends to land far more durably than even the truest sentence spoken on its behalf. This is the part that still puzzles people sitting with this story centuries later, and it does not resolve neatly within this chapter alone. And it will take another grief entirely in the chapter that follows to show what was actually being protected here. Not by an explanation that never came, but by something else altogether, something closer to action than to words. We are not finished with this question, we have only just opened it. Vacchagotta returned to her community, to her life, to the long, slow work that grief always requires, regardless of how wise the person carrying it happens to be. The text gives us no neat resolution to her sorrow within these pages. What it gives us instead is the shape of a question left deliberately, carefully open. The kind this entire story has, by now, taught us to recognize as anything but careless. There is a kind of respect embedded in that refusal to wrap her grief up too neatly. A respect for the actual scale of what she had lost, large enough that no tidy resolution, delivered too quickly, could have done it justice. If you've ever wanted someone to simply explain your pain to you and realized afterward that no explanation could have actually reached it, you already understand more about this chapter than any amount of doctrine could teach you directly. Hold on to that feeling, We are coming back to it from a different angle very soon. There is no tidy resolution offered here deliberately, and that absence of tidiness is itself part of what this chapter is trying to teach. And grief resists the kind of clean narrative arc most stories want to impose on it. A problem introduced, a solution offered, a resolution achieved by the final scene. Vacchagotta's chapter ends without that satisfaction because real grief, the kind this story is determined to treat honestly rather than decoratively, does not actually work that way either. Chapter 11. The nun who answered. With her hands, Vacchagotta's question still hasn't been answered in words. It's about to be answered another way entirely. And there is a deliberate structural choice in placing these two chapters back to back rather than separating them with other material. And it is worth naming directly. A contrast between them only lands fully if the listener carries Vacchagotta's unresolved question directly into this next story without distraction. Hold what was withheld from her a moment longer. What follows will not resolve it through more words. It will resolve it by showing what kind of response certain situations have actually been waiting for all along. Suba was a nun renowned, even within a community that had largely set aside such concerns for an unusual physical beauty. The kind of beauty that, in the world she had left behind, had drawn constant attention she had never wanted, and she had taken ordination specifically to step outside that world, to be valued finally for her practice and her mind, rather than for her face. For a time, this worked. The forest groves where nuns and monks of this era often walked alone, seeking solitude for meditation, were not, by any measure, designed with safety from this particular kind of threat in mind. A woman walking alone, even in robes, even under the protection a religious vow theoretically offered, remained vulnerable in ways the broader community did not always fully reckon with. And the texts preserve more than one account of nuns facing exactly this kind of danger during the Buddha's lifetime. Suba's story stands out not because the threat she faced was unusual for her time, but because of how completely, how unforgettably she answered it. Then, walking alone through a forest grove, she encountered a man who had apparently been watching her, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. He blocked her path and declared his obsession with her beauty outright, demanding that she abandon her vows, abandon her robes, abandon the entire life she had built, specifically because of how she looked. Picture, for a moment, exactly how cornered Subha's actual position was in this encounter, stripped of any romanticizing distance that 2,500 years of retelling might otherwise add. Alone in a remote grove, confronted by a man who had clearly planned this moment in advance, demanding she abandon a life she had deliberately built specifically to escape men exactly like him. There was no convenient ally nearby, no guarantee that calling out would summon help in time, no certainty that reasoning, however eloquently delivered, register against an obsession that had already convinced itself her physical appearance was the only fact about her that mattered. What followed is one of the more startling episodes preserved in the Therigatha, the collected verses of early Buddhist nuns. Suva did not run. She did not scream for help, though help may not have been near enough to reach her in time regardless. She did not, notably, launch into an extended philosophical argument about the impermanence of physical beauty, and the kind of argument that might have been technically correct and entirely useless against a man too consumed by obsession to hear reasoning of any kind. The Therigatha as a whole preserves dozens of these verses, composed by nuns across the early generations of the community, and it is worth situating Subha's story within that wider collection, rather than treating it as an isolated curiosity. These were women who had, in many cases, left behind marriages, family expectations, and significant social risk to pursue ordination in an era that offered them few other paths to anything resembling independence or intellectual respect. Their verses, taken together, read less like polished doctrine and more like hard-won testimony, accounts of grief, of struggle, of specific obstacles each woman had to face and overcome before arriving at whatever peace she eventually found. Subha's confrontation in the forest grove sits among these other testimonies as one of the most physically dramatic, but it shares with nearly all of them an unflinching honesty about how much real-world danger and real-world difficulty stood between these women and the practice they had chosen. This is not an essay. None. This is not a debate won through clever rhetoric. This is not a clever answer designed to outmaneuver him intellectually. According to the verses attributed to her, Suva calmly asked the man what, precisely, he found so captivating about her eyes, and when he answered, describing their color, their shape, the way they seemed to him like blue lotus petals, she removed one of her own eyes with her hand and held it out to him, not asking if he still found it so beautiful now that it was no longer attached to anything, no longer doing the seeing, simply a piece of flesh in her palm. The man, by the account, was horrified and fled. There is a final, almost overlooked detail in this account worth pausing on before moving past it. In the moment immediately following his flight, Subha is not described as collapsing into shock or relief, the way an act of such extremity might lead a modern reader to expect. The verses move directly into a calm reflection on the nature of beauty and its impermanence, suggesting a mind that had, somehow, the very act of ending the threat, also managed to keep its own footing entirely intact. Whatever this act cost her physically, it appears not to have cost her the steadiness this entire story has been tracing from its very first chapter. There's a reason this gets left out of the simple version of this story, and it is worth being honest about why. It is an extreme, almost unbearable act, and no one telling this story responsibly would suggest it as literal instruction for anyone facing harassment today. Now, but strip away the shock of the image for a moment, and look at what the act itself actually accomplished, because that is the part this entire story has been building toward across 2 full chapters now. Suva did not try to explain to her pursuer why he was wrong to want what he wanted. She did not try to talk him out of an obsession that, by its nature, was immune to reasoning. She ended the situation completely and permanently with a single irreversible action that made arguing about her beauty literally impossible going forward. And because the thing he was obsessed with no longer existed in a form he could fixate on. This is the answer to the question we left open at the end of Vacchagotta's chapter. An explanation can always be argued with, reinterpreted, resisted, outlasted by someone determined enough not to listen. An action, the right action, taken at the right moment with full commitment behind it, closes a door that words alone, however true, often cannot close. 9. Vacchagotta's grief was not given an explanation that could have ended it, because grief of that depth does not end through explanation. It has to be lived through slowly, the way only time and continued practice allow. Subha's danger, by contrast, was the kind of problem that a decisive action actually could end immediately and completely, and so that is exactly the tool she reached for, and instead of the explanation her attacker might have demanded but would never have actually accepted. It is worth holding these two chapters side by side one more time before moving forward, because together they sketch a kind of map most listeners never get handed explicitly. Some forms of suffering respond only to time, patience, and a widened perspective, the way Vacchagotta's grief eventually had to be lived through rather than solved. Other forms of danger respond only to immediate, decisive, irreversible action, the way Subha's threat required ending rather than understanding. Mistaking one category for the other, trying to outlast a danger that needed ending now, or trying to instantly resolve a grief that needed years, produces exactly the kind of mismatched, ineffective response this entire story has been quietly teaching its audience to recognize and avoid. There is a word worth holding here, one we have touched only briefly before in this story: metta, loving kindness. And it is worth being precise about what it does and does not mean in a moment like this. Metta is not passivity. It is not endless tolerance of harm in the name of being agreeable. Subha's act, read carefully, and was not an act of hatred toward the man who threatened her, nor was it self-harm born of despair. The verses describe her afterward as calm, clear, and ultimately said to have healed and continued her practice, with later tradition holding that her sight remarkably was restored. It was an act of absolute immovable boundary setting, performed with a steadiness that left no opening for negotiation, precisely because no negotiation with an obsession of that kind was ever going to end safely through words. It is worth distinguishing, too, between the kind of fear that might have produced an act like this and the calm described in the verses. A person acting purely out of panic does not typically pause to ask a clarifying question first, the way Subha is recorded as doing before responding. The verses describe something closer to a deliberate, almost surgical decision, made under enormous pressure but not made in blind terror. The same quality of clear-eyed steadiness this story has traced through every chapter so far, here applied not to a philosophical debate or a king's guilt, but to the urgent physical reality of a woman's own safety. If this is landing for you, consider sharing this chapter specifically. Stories like Subha's rarely get told in full. They deserve to be heard exactly as difficult and as clarifying as they actually are. Has there ever been a moment in your own life where you realized an action, not an explanation, was the only thing that would actually end a situation? That's worth sitting with and worth telling me about below. There is a far gentler version of this same principle worth pairing alongside Subha's extreme example, one nearly every listener has lived through in some form already. Think of a parent sitting beside a child who has just asked the hardest question a child can ask, about death. About why someone they loved is gone and never coming back, about a question with no answer that could possibly satisfy a child's need for the world to make sense again. The parents who handle that moment best, by every account anyone who has lived it can offer, are rarely the ones who produce the most articulate explanation. They are the ones who simply stay, who hold the child without rushing to fill the silence with words that promise more certainty than anyone actually has. Think, too, of how often the opposite instinct takes over in exactly these moments. The urge to explain quickly, to offer some comforting framework before the silence becomes unbearable for the adult in the room, even when the child has not yet finished needing the silence itself. The discomfort of sitting quietly beside someone else's pain, unresolved, is often greater for the person trying to help than for the person actually suffering, and a great deal of unhelpful explanation, offered with the best of intentions, exists mainly to relieve that discomfort rather than to serve the grieving person at all. Presence offered steadily and without flinching does something explanation cannot. It tells the child wordlessly that they are not alone in not knowing, which turns out again and again to matter far more than knowing ever could. This is the same principle Visakha's chapter opened, and this chapter has now closed, not by giving grief the explanation it asked for, but by showing what was being protected by withholding it. Room enough for the only thing that ever actually helps with loss of that size, which is not an answer, but accompaniment. 2 chapters, 2 women, 2 entirely different kinds of suffering, none, and one single underlying lesson connecting them across every difference of circumstance. Sometimes the most loving thing available is not the truest sentence you could construct, but the steadiest presence you can offer, unsustained for exactly as long as it takes. Chapter 12, The King with his father's blood on his hands. From a nun's private courage in a forest grove, the story now turns to a king's public terror, carried into a room full of witnesses by a man who had done something almost no one in his position recovers from. Suba faced a threat to her body and her vows. Ajatasattu, by contrast, brought a threat entirely of his own making, a danger that lived inside him rather than approaching him from outside. This shift matters because everything this story has demonstrated about meeting external danger with stillness will now be tested against something harder still. Whether that same stillness can do anything at all for a person whose real enemy is not standing in front of him, but is instead his own unbearable memory of what he has already done. Ajatasattu had murdered his own father. King Bimbisara, one of the Buddha's earliest and most devoted royal patrons, to seize the throne for himself. Bimbisara had been, by every account, a genuinely close friend and supporter of the community for decades, a kind of relationship that made Ajatasattu's crime land not merely as a political assassination but as a betrayal felt directly inside the very religious circle his father had helped sustain. Guilt, by every account of his later behavior, did not leave him in peace. The Samanya Phala Sutta records him arriving on the night of a full moon, surrounded by physicians and ministers, to seek out the Buddha not for theological debate, not for blessing, but for something far more desperate, some kind of relief from the unbearable interior pressure of what he had done. And picture the scene as the text seems to want us to picture it. A full moon overhead, a king who could not sleep, who could not sit still in his own palace any longer, finally giving in to whatever desperation drove him out into the night, surrounded by an entourage of advisors who must have wondered themselves what exactly their king was hoping to find from a teacher he had no particular prior relationship with. There is a detail in the sutta worth dwelling on for what it reveals about the precise texture of Ajatasattu's fear that night. As his procession approached the grove where the Buddha was staying, he is recorded as suddenly gripped by terror, asking his physician whether this entire visit might be some kind of trap, whether the unusual silence surrounding the community at this late hour, no voices, no movement, nothing but quiet, might mean an ambush waited for him among the trees. The physician reassured him that this profound stillness was simply how a community of more than 1,000 monks ordinarily sounded when gathered in meditation, a detail that, taken on its own, tells you something remarkable about the scale of discipline this single community had cultivated by this point in the story. More than 1,000 people, now sitting together in such complete silence that a visiting king mistook the absence of noise for evidence of an ambush. There is a quiet irony embedded in this exact moment, easy to miss on a first reading but worth drawing out explicitly. A guilty king, terrified of silence because his own conscience had taught him to associate quiet with danger. is about to walk directly into the very source of the deepest, most disciplined silence available anywhere in his kingdom, and find inside it not an ambush, but the first genuine relief he had experienced since the night he murdered his own father. He arrived expecting, perhaps, one of two things: either judgment, a teacher condemning him outright for patricide, confirming the guilt already eating at him from the inside, or argument, an attempt to talk him through some elaborate moral reasoning that might or might not have actually touched the rawness of what he was carrying. He received neither. The Buddha did not condemn him. He did not flinch away from him, did not treat him as untouchable or unworthy of address, despite Ajatasattu's crime being, by any standard, one of the gravest available to a human being. And he did not argue him out of his guilt either, did not produce a clever philosophical maneuver designed to talk the king into feeling better about what he had done. He simply received him, calm, unthreatened, entirely undisturbed by being in the presence of a man capable of murdering his own father. It is worth pausing on just how isolating Ajatasattu's particular crime would have made him, the social and religious context of his era. Patricide ranked in the moral hierarchies of the time among the very gravest offenses a person could commit, worse in many traditional reckonings than almost any other crime available, precisely because it violated the bond considered most fundamental to social and cosmic order alike. A king guilty of this offense could reasonably have expected universal horror. Quiet avoidance, the kind of social isolation that compounds guilt with loneliness until the combination becomes nearly unbearable. That the Buddha, of all people, the very teacher his own murdered father had devoted himself to supporting, would receive him without visible horror or avoidance was, in itself, before a single word of teaching had even been exchanged, already doing something no lecture on ethics could have accomplished on its own. Watch what the silence costs him here, because there is a cost, even if it is not visible the way fear or anger would be visible. And, sitting calmly across from a man whose own guards likely accompanied him out of genuine concern for what he might do, the Buddha's stillness required something far harder than simply not being afraid. It required a kind of attention capable of seeing past the crime to the suffering currently consuming the man who had committed it, without either excusing the crime or being consumed in turn by horror at it. There is a Pali word for the seat of this kind of steady attention, one that has been quietly present underneath every chapter of this story without yet being named directly. Chitta, heart-mind, not simply the thinking intellect, and not simply emotion either, but the whole felt, knowing center of a person, the thing that registers fear or calm long before any thought has fully formed about why. And Ajatasattu's chitta was in turmoil, consumed by an act it could not undo. The Buddha's chitta, by every account, remained settled in front of him, not because the king's crime didn't register as horrific, but because that settledness had been built deliberately over decades, specifically so it would not collapse in exactly this kind of moment, a moment when an unsettled response would have caused the most damage to a person standing right at the edge of something far worse. There is a particular kind of courage embedded in simply receiving someone like Ajatasattu without flinching. A courage easy to overlook because it produces no dramatic visible action at all. And a more anxious presence in that room, even one with the best intentions, might have communicated through some small involuntary gesture, a flicker of fear or judgment, and that flicker, landing on a man already drowning in guilt and already half expecting condemnation, could easily have confirmed his worst fear about himself and pushed him further from whatever relief he had come seeking. The Buddha's stillness functioned as a kind of mirror with no distortion in it at all, reflecting back to Ajatasattu neither the monster he feared he had become nor a false absolution he hadn't earned, but simply a steady, undisturbed presence willing to sit with him exactly as he actually was. It is worth noting how the sutta frames Ajatasattu's eventual response to this entire encounter, not as instant transformation, not as a dramatic conversion scene, but as something quieter and more durable. A man who left that meeting still carrying the weight of what he had done, now still a king who would have to govern and answer for his own past for the rest of his life, but evidently steadied enough by the encounter that his later relationship with the Buddhist community shifted from threat to support. Some traditions go further, suggesting that this single encounter marked a genuine turning point in how Ajatasattu governed for the remainder of his reign. A king who had begun his rule through patricide eventually remembered, at least some later accounts, as a patron who helped convene one of the earliest councils responsible for preserving the Buddha's teachings after his death. An extraordinary trajectory for a man who once arrived in the dead of night, terrified, expecting either condemnation or an argument he was not prepared to win. What followed was a long and careful conversation, recorded as one of the most extensive philosophical dialogues in the entire canon, about the fruits of a contemplative life, about what is actually gained through spiritual practice in this very life, not merely promised in some future one. Ajatasattu, by the Suta's account, left that meeting not absolved, not pardoned, not magically freed from the weight of what he had done, but changed enough, settled enough, that he is later remembered as a supporter of the Buddhist community rather than its enemy. The dialogue itself, in its full recorded form, walks through the visible, observable benefits a contemplative life produces at each successive stage of practice, beginning with something as ordinary as the simple ease of a person no longer driven by restless craving, moving gradually through deeper states of concentration, before arriving at the kind of liberating insight this entire story has been circling since its very first chapter. Notice the deliberate ordinariness of where this answer begins. The Buddha did not open by promising Ajatasattu some distant cosmic reward in exchange for ethical reform. He began with something a guilt-ridden and sleepless king could recognize immediately in his own body, the simple, tangible relief available to anyone willing to stop feeding the craving and restlessness currently consuming him. Now, here is the question this chapter leaves open, and it is worth holding all the way to where the story turns next. Can stillness alone, calm presence, undisturbed attention, the simple refusal to flinch or condemn, actually disarm a guilty, dangerous man? Or does it need something more, some further test, before we can trust that this kind of steadiness holds up under the hardest possible conditions? The stakes here have widened again, the way they have widened, chapter after chapter, across this entire story. We began with one monk's private confusion. We have now arrived at a king capable of killing his own father, sitting calmly across from a teacher who refused to be afraid of him. What comes next will ask whether that same stillness can survive a test even harder than this one. Not a threat from outside the community, but a fracture from within it. There is a sobering thought worth carrying forward from this chapter into the one ahead. Stillness had, by this point in the story, succeeded against nearly every external threat thrown at it. A charging elephant, a rival's campaign, a guilty king's desperation. It would be tempting, watching this unbroken streak, to conclude that calm presence alone could resolve any conflict whatsoever given enough patience. The next chapter exists specifically to correct that assumption, gently but firmly, before the story allows itself to be mistaken for a simple formula. Chapter 13, when his own followers turned on each other. If silence could disarm a patricide king, surely it could hold together a community of his own monks. It couldn't, not at first. And what happened instead is one of the most quietly devastating episodes in the entire life of the Buddha. At Kosambi, a dispute broke out among the monks over something almost absurdly small in its origin. Accounts describe a disagreement beginning with a minor rule violation involving leftover water in a latrine, and whether the monk responsible should be formally reprimanded for it. What started as a trivial procedural disagreement hardened, the way these things do, into entrenched factions, each side certain of its own righteousness, each refusing to back down out of pride as much as principle. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how small the original disagreement was, because the gap between its size and the size of the rupture it eventually caused is, itself, the entire lesson of this chapter. One monk left water in a container after using a latrine against a minor procedural rule. Another monk pointed this out. The first monk did not feel he had broken any rule serious enough to warrant the reprimand suggested. Supporters gathered around each man, not because either position was especially compelling on its merits, but because taking sides, once begun, has a way of recruiting loyalty long after the original issue has stopped mattering to anyone involved. And there is a recognizable pattern here that extends well beyond any single monastic community, ancient or modern. The size of a conflict's origin almost never predicts the size of the rupture it eventually produces. And because what actually drives escalation is rarely the original issue at all. It is identity. The moment a disagreement stops being about whether water was properly disposed of and becomes, instead, about which side a person belongs to, which faction has been wronged, whose honor is now at stake in continuing to hold the line. Once a dispute crosses that threshold, the facts of the original disagreement become almost irrelevant to its continuation. People do not maintain feuds because the underlying issue still matters to them. They maintain feuds because backing down has come to feel, however irrationally, like a betrayal of everyone who has already taken their side. This is precisely what made Kosambi such a uniquely difficult test for the pattern this story has been tracing. Now, every previous silence we have examined worked, in part because it addressed a specific person's specific confusion or specific danger. Something a carefully chosen response, or carefully chosen absence of response could actually touch. A factional dispute rooted in group identity rather than individual confusion does not respond the same way to individual attention, however wise. There was no single Vacchagotta to sit across from here, no single Malunkyaputta whose particular confusion could be redirected with a well-chosen parable. There were dozens of monks, each reinforced by the social pressure of standing alongside others who had already committed to a position. And against that kind of collective momentum, even direct intervention from the most respected teacher any of them had ever known proved insufficient. The Buddha intervened directly, more than once, urging reconciliation, explaining patiently that the dispute itself mattered far less than the harmony being destroyed in pursuing it. The monks, remarkably, would not listen, not to each other and not even to him. The factional dispute continued, bitter and entrenched, despite the direct personal involvement of the very teacher whose authority the entire community was supposedly built around. And it is worth sitting with how unusual this single fact actually is within the broader shape of this story. In every previous chapter, direct engagement from the Buddha, whether through speech, through parable, or through calm, unthreatened presence, had eventually produced the result it was aiming for, sometimes immediately, sometimes only after considerable time had passed. Here, for the first time, direct engagement simply failed, not repeatedly, in real time, in front of him. This single failure matters enormously for how the rest of this story should be understood, because it prevents exactly the kind of oversimplified takeaway a less honest retelling might have settled for. That calm, wise intervention always eventually works if the person delivering it is sufficiently skilled. And Kosambi stands as the clearest possible evidence against that comfortable conclusion. Notice what just happened, because it undercuts every assumption a casual listener might have built up across this story so far. And we have watched silence work again and again, disarming a killer king, dissolving a rival's campaign, resolving a confused disciple's doubt. Here, for the first time in this entire arc, even direct, spoken intervention from the Buddha himself failed to resolve a conflict. The monks kept arguing, the community kept fracturing, and so he did something that, on first hearing, sounds almost like giving up. He left. not in anger, none. The texts are careful to specify, and not as punishment. He simply walked away from Kosambi entirely, alone, into a nearby forest, where the only company he kept, by the most famous version of this story, was an elephant named Parilayaka. An animal who, in the absence of human community willing to listen to him, is described as bringing him water, clearing his path, and standing guard, offering a kind of simple, undemanding presence that the quarreling monks, in their pride, had stopped offering each other. There is something quietly devastating in the image of this particular companionship, if you let yourself sit with it rather than rush past it as a charming legend. The most respected teacher in the region, capable of commanding the attention of kings, had been reduced by the pride of his own followers, not to seeking company from an animal in the forest, not because the animal understood the teaching, but because the animal, unlike the men he had just left behind, did not need to be right. There is a kind of relief, worth naming honestly, in companionship that asks nothing of you except your presence. No argument to win, no faction to defend, no grievance to nurse. Whatever comfort Paralayaka actually offered, the texts seem at pains to emphasize the relief of simply being with a creature incapable of factional pride, after weeks spent surrounded by men who, however devoted to the same teaching, had proven entirely capable of exactly that. This is the kind of stillness you can still hear centuries later, precisely because of how uncomfortable it is. The same instinct that once disarmed Ajatasattu, calm, unthreatened presence in the face of conflict, here produced not resolution but withdrawal. The Buddha did not stay and force the issue. He did not use his authority to compel obedience, not threaten expulsion or punishment to end the dispute by decree. He removed himself and let the absence itself become the only teaching left available to monks who had stopped being able to hear anything else. There is a Pali word worth pausing on here, one that names something close to the very heart of what made this withdrawal possible rather than simply an act of despair: sankhara, conditioned formations. The idea that everything arising, including a community's quarrel, including a teacher's patience finally reaching its limit, is itself constructed, dependent, the product of countless causes and conditions, and therefore neither permanent nor, ultimately, something to cling to or fight against past the point of usefulness. And there is the older phrase this entire story has circled since its very first chapter, now arriving in its hardest test yet: Tunhibhava, noble silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has said everything useful that words could say, and now trusts the situation itself rather than further argument to finish the lesson. Consider how different this withdrawal is from anything we have seen before in this story. The silence under the Bodhi tree was a question still being decided, and the silence in front of Vacchagotta was a precisely calibrated non-answer. The stillness in front of the charging elephant and the stillness in front of Ajatasattu were both, in their way, victories achieved through sheer presence. Here, for the first and only time across this entire arc, the wisest available response produces, in the short term, not resolution but separation. A teacher alone in a forest, a community still fractured, months passing with no guarantee the rupture would ever heal at all. This chapter exists specifically to prevent the story from being mistaken for a magic formula that always works if applied correctly. Sometimes the most disciplined silence available still has to wait, exposed to real risk, for circumstances outside anyone's control to finish what words and presence alone could not. This is the resolution to the open question planted back when Ajatasattu sat calmly across from a teacher unafraid of him. Stillness disarmed a guilty king because the king, however dangerous, still wanted something the Buddha could offer: relief, understanding, a way through his guilt. The monks at Kosambi wanted something different: to be right, not to win, to have their own faction vindicated, and against that particular hunger, even the deepest stillness available could not force resolution. It could only, eventually, given enough time and enough absence, let pride exhaust itself on its own. The same tool that disarmed a killer cost something real here. Months of separation, a community fractured, a teacher alone in a forest with only an elephant for company. Proof that this entire pattern, however wise, was never magic and never without cost. Eventually, the story tells us, lay supporters in the nearby town grew so frustrated with the quarreling monks, refusing them the customary alms and respect the community ought to show its religious teachers, that the monks themselves, deprived of support and finally humbled by the very ordinary practical consequence of their own pride, sought reconciliation on their own without further intervention needed. The Buddha returned. The dispute finally dissolved. Not because anyone won the argument, but because everyone involved finally grew tired enough of losing something they actually valued to let go of something they had only thought they valued. There is something almost humbling in the literal sense about how this resolution actually arrived, especially set against the loftiness of everything we have traced across this story so far. Kings, killers, nods kneeling before lotus flowers. Here, the actual mechanism of reconciliation was bred in respect, withheld by ordinary villagers tired of supporting monks who could not behave decently toward one another. No grand teaching delivered the final blow to the monk's pride. Hunger, social pressure, and the slow accumulation of practical consequence did what neither argument nor withdrawal alone had been able to accomplish. It is worth remembering this detail specifically, because it complicates any temptation to romanticize the entire pattern this story is tracing into something too elegant, too purely spiritual. And sometimes wisdom needs an unglamorous assist from ordinary circumstance before it can finish its work. There's a detail here easy to miss, and it might be the most important one in this entire chapter. Not even the wisest possible use of silence cannot force anyone to want reconciliation before they are ready to want it. The Buddha's withdrawal did not manufacture humility in the quarreling monks. It simply removed an audience for their pride and waited patiently for the natural consequences of stubbornness to do what argument and even sustained presence could not. This single limitation, honestly preserved rather than smoothed over by the tradition that passed this story down, does more to establish the credibility of everything else this story has claimed than almost any of its successes could have. And a story that only ever showed silence winning every single time against every kind of opposition would eventually start to feel less like an honest account of a real teacher's real life and more like a polished fable constructed after the fact to flatter its subject. Kosambi's failure, sitting honestly inside this otherwise triumphant narrative, is what makes the triumphs elsewhere in the story worth trusting at all. We are close, now, to the end of this story, closer than the length of the road behind us might suggest. Every silence so far has been building toward one final, ultimate test of this same pattern. A silence a man keeps in the last hours of his own life, when there is no more time left to wait for anyone's pride to exhaust itself, and no more chapters left in which to resolve what remains unsaid. If you've ever had to walk away from a conflict you knew you couldn't win through more talking, no matter how right you believed yourself to be, that's the feeling this chapter is built around. And if this story has been worth your time so far, this is the moment to make sure you don't lose track of it. There's one more major turn ahead, and it's the one this entire video has been quietly building toward since the very first chapter. Chapter 14, The Last Silence. Every silence in this story has been leading somewhere. Here is where they all arrive. And 13 chapters of arrows and lotus flowers, of kings and killers and grieving grandmothers, of an elephant calm before a charge and an elephant standing patient in a forest, have all been quietly building toward this final reckoning. Every earlier silence asked a version of the same question in a different costume. When does withholding serve and when does it merely hide? The very last silence this story has to offer asks that question one final time. Under the highest possible stakes, not someone else's understanding, not someone else's danger, but the teacher's own death, not arriving exactly as everything conditioned eventually arrives at its ending. By the time the Buddha reached old age, 80 years by the traditional count, a body that had carried this teaching across decades of walking, teaching, and traveled through one of the wider stretches of human civilization in his era, he had grown frail. The Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the long account of his final months, records a journey toward the small town of Kushinagar undertaken with full knowledge, by every indication in the text that it would be his last. By this point in his life, the man who had once walked alone, with nothing, ignored 5 suspicious ascetics at Deer Park, was traveling with a substantial community around him, monks who had devoted their entire adult lives to a teaching that had, by now, spread across kingdoms and outlived several of the very kings who had once met him in person. And yet the final journey itself, by the Sutta's account, retained the same unhurried, undramatic quality that had marked every silence and every spoken word across this entire story. No final grand procession, no staged farewell tour, simply an old man walking, stopping where the road required him to stop, teaching where teaching was still useful, exactly as he always had. The text does not shy away from describing his physical decline in these final months with a directness many later, more reverent retellings tend to soften. And he is recorded telling Ananda, at one point along this final journey, that his body now resembled a worn-out cart, held together more by makeshift repair than by its own original strength. And there is something quietly moving in the willingness of the earliest tradition to preserve this image rather than replace it with something more dignified. A teacher comparing his own failing body to a cart in need of constant patching, offered without complaint, simply as an honest observation about the condition he now found himself in. The same unflinching honesty that had refused easy answers to Malunkyaputta and refused false comfort to Visakha was, here, earned with equal steadiness on his own mortality. Notice the deliberate echo in choosing this particular image, a cart in need of repair, to describe his own failing body so near the very end of this story. And the very first teaching ever given, all the way back at Deer Park, had used a wheel slightly out of true as its central image for dukkha, the friction inherent in all conditioned things. Here, decades later, the man who first offered that image applies it, without flinching, to himself. No longer the teacher pointing outward at a wheel belonging to someone else's cart, but the cart itself, worn by exactly the kind of friction his own first sermon had described, demonstrating in his own failing body the very truth his teaching had always insisted, applied to absolutely everything, including, eventually, the teacher. Along the way, he stopped at the home of a blacksmith named Kunda who offered him a meal. A dish whose exact ingredients remain debated by scholars to this day, but whose effect was not debated at all by the text. And shortly afterward, the Buddha fell seriously ill, with symptoms severe enough that he understood, by his own account to Ananda, that death was now close. Here is something worth sitting with before the story moves further, because it says everything about the consistency of the man we have followed across 13 chapters already. He did not blame Kunda. He did not allow anyone around him to blame Kunda either. Knowing, by every indication, that this meal would be remembered forever as connected to his death, he instructed Ananda specifically to ensure that no shame or blame would ever attach itself to the blacksmith. That Kunda's offering, made in good faith and genuine devotion, should be remembered as one of the most meritorious gifts of his entire life, equal in spiritual weight to the meal that had nourished him on the very night of his enlightenment, decades before. A dying man's last recorded act of protection was not aimed at himself. It was aimed at shielding an ordinary, well-meaning stranger from a guilt that was never his to carry. No. Consider how perfectly this gesture closes a circle that began all the way back at the start of this story. The man under the Bodhi tree had worried in his great silence about people too consumed by their own confusion and craving to be worth the effort of teaching. Here, in his final hours, with every reason to focus entirely on his own approaching death, his last concern was for a blacksmith who would otherwise have spent the rest of his life believing he had killed the most important teacher of his era. And the same attentiveness that had once sorted lotus flowers by how much dust covered their eyes was, even now, still looking outward, still asking what this particular person, in this particular moment, actually needed. The journey continued, slower now, toward a grove of sal trees outside Kushinagar, where, lying down between two trees that are said to have burst suddenly into unseasonal bloom, scattering their flowers over him, a Buddha prepared, with what the text presents as total, unshaken composure, for the end of his life. Around him gathered monks who had walked with him for decades, and monks who had joined only recently, supporters from the surrounding region drawn by news that the teacher's final hours were approaching, and a steadily growing weight of grief that pressed against the very composure he was modeling for everyone present. Is recorded as continuing to teach even now, answering final questions, offering final instructions on matters of discipline and conduct for the community that would have to carry on without him, attending, in his last conscious hours, to the practical needs of people who would soon need to function entirely on their own. Among those present by later tradition, if not always by the earliest layer of the text itself, was Mahapajapati Gautami, the woman who had raised the Buddha after his own mother's death in childbirth, who had herself fought for years to be permitted ordination as a nun, becoming the very first woman to receive it, and who had spent decades since leading a growing community of women within the broader Sangha. Her presence in these final hours closes a quieter loop than the master loop this story has been tracing, but a meaningful one nonetheless. The woman who had once nursed an infant whose own mother could not survive his birth now stood, decades later, among those keeping vigil as that same infant, grown old, prepared to die. The teaching that had begun with a question about suffering's origin had, by its very last hours, gathered around itself almost the entire span of one human life, from its most vulnerable beginning to its most composed ending. Her own path to ordination had required a persistence worth remembering here in this final grove one final time. By most accounts, she had asked and been refused more than once before finally being granted permission on terms that required considerable additional negotiation on her behalf by Ananda himself. And the same community now gathered to witness its founder's death had only become capable of including her, and the women who followed her example, because someone had been willing to keep asking a difficult question until the answer finally changed. It is a small, easily overlooked detail amid the weight of everything else unfolding in this final chapter, but it belongs here precisely because this entire story has insisted, from its very first pages, that the small, easily overlooked details are often where the real teaching is actually happening. It was here, in these final hours, that the master open loop planted all the way back in Chapter 1 finally swings shut. Remember where we began. A newly awakened man, sitting under a different tree entirely, weeks after his enlightenment, seriously considering letting the deepest realization available to any living being die with him, unspoken, rather than risk the exhausting, uncertain work of trying to teach it to a world he doubted was ready to listen. He chose, eventually, to speak, but only after being shown, carefully, that some being stood close enough to the surface of the water to be reached. 45 years separate that first hesitation from this final grove, a gap of time large enough to contain an entire lifetime of teaching, travel, conflict, reconciliation, and quiet, patient repetition of the same essential discipline across thousands of individual encounters. This story has only had room to sample a handful of, and yet arriving here at the very end of that long span, a question facing him is in its essential shape almost identical to the one he faced at the beginning. Should this understanding be entrusted to a single person, or released to find its own way, however imperfectly, among everyone capable of receiving it. Now, decades later, dying, surrounded by grieving disciples, Ananda among them, weeping privately before being gently corrected and steadied by his own teacher even in these final hours. The Buddha was asked more than once who should lead the community after he was gone. Surely the question implied, a teaching this important, carried by one man for this long, needed a single named successor, someone to hold the authority together and keep the community from fracturing the way it nearly had at Kosambi. He refused to name one. This is not abandonment. This is not absence dressed up as wisdom. This is not the end of the teaching disguised as a dying man's failure to plan properly for what would come after him. What he offered instead, in some of the most quoted words in the entire tradition, was this: be your own lamp. Let the Dhamma itself, the teaching, be your refuge rather than any single person claiming to hold final authority over it. Consider how perfectly this instruction completes the very first lesson this entire story ever offered. Back at Deer Park, when 5 suspicious ascetics first learned that liberation was something each of them would have to walk toward themselves through their own effort, rather than something a teacher could simply hand to them ready-made. Now, Be Your Own Lamp asks for exactly that same self-reliance, scaled up now to an entire community facing the loss of the only teacher any of them had ever known. The light was never meant to be borrowed permanently from any single source. It was meant from the very beginning to be kindled in each person individually, not capable of continuing to burn long after whatever first lit it had gone dark. Notice the exact shape of the symmetry here, because it is the entire reason this story has been built the way it has been built across 14 chapters. The same instinct that at the very beginning nearly buried this teaching entirely. The recognition that no single voice, however awakened, can carry the whole weight of liberation for everyone else is the very same instinct that at the very end refuses to let the teaching collapse into dependence on any single successor, any single throne of authority that could later be captured, corrupted, or fought over the way Devadatta had once tried to capture it by force. A silence that almost buried the teaching at the start is the same silence, matured now across an entire lifetime, that protects it from ever being owned by one person at the end. And it is worth dwelling on how much trust this final refusal required, more trust in some ways than the original decision to teach at all. Speaking under the Bodhi tree had at least kept the teaching within his own direct control, shaped by his own ongoing presence and correction. Refusing to name a successor meant releasing that control entirely, trusting a teaching he would no longer be present to protect or clarify, trusting a community that had within his own lifetime already shown itself capable of the kind of entrenched, prideful fracturing witnessed at Kosambi. None. He chose, even knowing this, to let the teaching itself, rather than any single inheritor of his authority, be the thing that held the community together after he was gone. One last figure approached in those final hours. A wandering ascetic named Subhada, who arrived at the grove insisting on an audience despite the monk's attempts to turn him away, given how close to death the Buddha now was. Subhada wanted, even now, and even at the very last possible moment, one final question answered: whether various other teachers of the era had achieved the realizations they claimed. The dying Buddha, with what little strength remained to him, answered this one directly and plainly, urging Subhada not to focus on comparing claims between teachers, but on the actual presence or absence of the Eightfold Path within any teaching whatsoever. A true answer given freely, even in his very last hours, because this was in fact exactly the kind of question that could still serve someone's liberation, right up to the end. And Subhada is recorded as the last person to be personally ordained by the Buddha while he still lived. Picture the determination this final encounter required from Subhada himself, and pushing past monks actively trying to protect their dying teacher's remaining strength, insisting that his question mattered enough to interrupt whatever peace those final hours might otherwise have offered. And picture, too, a discipline it required from the Buddha to recognize, even now with death visibly close, that this particular question deserved a direct answer rather than a gentle deflection toward rest. And every other question across this entire story had been weighed against the same basic test. Does answering serve liberation, or does it merely serve curiosity? And even in his last conscious hours, that same weighing continued, undiminished by his own physical collapse. Ananda's grief in these final hours deserves its own moment of attention, because it completes an arc that began all the way back in chapter 5. The same attendant who had once stood confused beside an unanswered question to Vacchagotta now stood, decades later, fully capable of recognizing wisdom in his teacher's choices, and yet still, by every account, undone with sorrow at the prospect of losing him. Understanding this story has shown again and again does not eliminate grief. It does not even necessarily make grief smaller. What it does when it arrives is give grief somewhere honest to stand. Ananda wept by the text's own account and was gently corrected not for weeping but for momentarily losing sight of the very impermanence he had spent decades being taught to recognize. The correction itself was offered with evident tenderness, one last small act of teaching folded into the middle of the very event the teaching had always been preparing everyone present to face. And then, surrounded by his community, Ananda among them, Mahapajapati Gotami, the woman who had raised him after his own mother's death and who had herself become an ordained nun decades before, present among the grieving as well. The Buddha spoke his final recorded words. All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. The Pali word underneath this teaching, anicca, impermanence, had threaded through every single chapter of this entire story without always being named outright. The law that nothing arising stays, that every silence and every spoken word alike was always going to pass, the way the man speaking them now was passing in this moment beneath the blooming trees. It is worth noticing how perfectly these final words distill everything this story has tried to demonstrate across 14 chapters into a single simple sentence, not a final doctrine to memorize, not a final command requiring obedience. An observation about the nature of things, paired with an instruction about how to respond to that observation. Strive on with diligence, knowing that everything you build, everything you understand, everything you love will eventually pass exactly as this moment is now passing. There is no contradiction in these final words between accepting impermanence and continuing to make effort. If anything, the two ideas depend on each other entirely. It is precisely because nothing lasts that the effort made within the time available matters as much as it. Then he was silent, and this time the silence did not break. None. Every other silence across this entire story had eventually given way to something. A god's plea breaking through, a king's question answered, a community's reconciliation finally arriving after months of separation. This final silence asked nothing of the people gathered around him, and offered nothing further in return. It simply was, complete in itself, the way the very first silence under the Bodhi tree had once threatened to become complete in itself. Before Sahampati's pleading lotus pond convinced an undecided man that some silences are worth interrupting. No one interrupted this one. No one could have. And by every indication in how the story has built toward this exact moment across 14 chapters, no one should have tried. There is a particular quality to the silence that settles over a room in the seconds after someone takes their last breath. Anyone who has sat with a dying parent, a dying friend, a dying partner, knows this silence by feel, even if they have never had words for it. It is not the same as an empty room. It is heavier than that, fuller than that, somehow, despite containing no sound at all. And grief has not yet fully arrived in that first moment. It is still arriving. The way light from a very distant star is still arriving long after its source has gone out. And what fills the space instead, briefly, entirely, is simply the fact of the silence itself, total, undeniable, asking nothing of anyone in the room except to be witnessed. Anyone who has lived through that moment also knows how strange the urge can be. In the seconds right after, not to speak, to say something, anything, to break the unbearable density of that particular quiet, even though no words available in that moment have ever been adequate to what just happened. The discipline this entire story has been tracing, the discipline of knowing when silence serves and when it merely avoids, finds perhaps its purest and most universal expression here. In a moment, every single person watching this video will eventually face, whether at someone else's bedside or one day their own. That is the silence the grove outside Kushinagar held, multiplied across an entire grieving community instead of a single room. Every silence across this entire story, the silence under the Bodhi tree, the silence in front of Vacchagotta, the silence that withdrew into a forest rather than argue with quarreling monks, had been building all along without anyone fully realizing it toward this final, total, irreversible one. Man who had once almost let his teaching die unspoken now died himself, having spoken everything that needed speaking and having protected in his very last conscious acts the one thing that mattered more to him than being remembered correctly. That what he had found would belong after him to no one and to everyone, exactly as it always should have. Not Chapter 15, what the silence was saying all along centuries past, the silence doesn't. In a cave in China, hundreds of years after the grove at Kushinagar had gone quiet, a monk named Bodhidharma is said to have sat facing a blank stone wall for 9 years, refusing to speak, refusing nearly everyone who came seeking instruction. Now, until those who genuinely needed to understand had proven it through their own persistence rather than through his words. The most famous account tells of a would-be student standing outside his cave through a snowstorm and truly cutting off his own arm to demonstrate the seriousness of his determination before Bodhidharma finally turned and acknowledged him. The story may be more legend than literal history, the way so much of what survives across centuries tends to be. But legends survive specifically because they preserve something true about a pattern people recognized and needed to keep telling. Bodhidharma's wall became one more chapter in a story that had started under a different tree, in a different country, 1,000 years before he was born. The thread connecting a riverbank in Magadha to a cave wall in China is not on its surface an obvious one. Different language, different century, different culture entirely, yet the discipline at the center of both is identical. A refusal to hand over understanding cheaply. A trust that the silence itself, held long enough, would do work that explanation alone never could. It is worth asking why this particular discipline, of all the things a teaching tradition could have carried forward across so many centuries and cultures, proved durable enough to keep resurfacing in such strikingly similar form, again and again, in places as different from one another as a Greek-ruled Indian kingdom and a remote Chinese mountain cave. Most teachings, transmitted across enough centuries and enough translation, gradually drift and accumulate local variation, blur into something only loosely related to where they began. This particular discipline, knowing when speech serves and when it merely performs, and trusting silence to finish what words cannot, appears instead to have survived translation almost perfectly intact, recognizable across every culture that received it, and precisely because it does not depend on any particular language or doctrine to function. It depends only on careful attention to one specific person, in one specific moment, and which is exactly the kind of thing that transfers cleanly across any cultural boundary, because every human culture eventually produces people in genuine need of being read that carefully. This is, in the end, why a story built almost entirely out of named individuals. A king here, a grieving grandmother there, a monk facing a wall, a teacher walking through a bombed village, manages to feel less like ancient history and more like a mirror the longer you sit with it. Every single figure across these 15 chapters was, in their own moment, simply a person standing in front of another person weighing whether speaking would help or harm. That is not a historical curiosity confined to ancient Magadha. It is something every listener watching this video has already faced today, in some smaller form, and will face again before the day is finished. In the forests of 20th century Thailand, a teacher named Ajahn Chah became known for exactly this same quality. Translated into a far more recent idiom, long unhurried silences in response to eager students demanding quick answers to questions about enlightenment, about meditation technique, about exactly how long it would take to achieve what they had come to achieve. Let go a little, he would often say, and peace a little will follow. Let go a lot, and a lot of peace will follow. But underneath the words, students who spent real time with him consistently described the silences between his sentences as carrying more instruction than the sentences themselves. The same pattern, recognizable across 25 centuries and an ocean of cultural distance, still doing exactly the work it had always done. Students who traveled long distances to study with Ajahn Chah, often Westerners arriving with exactly the kind of urgency Sunakata once carried, expecting rapid, dramatic transformation, frequently describe an initial period of real frustration at how little he seemed willing to explain on demand. He would set them to work on ordinary monastic chores, answer pointed questions with a story about a tree or a dog rather than a direct doctrinal explanation, and let weeks or months pass before whatever he was actually teaching became visible to them at all. The frustration, nearly every account, eventually gave way to exactly the kind of understanding words alone could never have produced quickly enough to matter. And in the 20th century's worst conflicts, a Vietnamese monk named Thich Nhat Hanh carried this same discipline directly into the middle of war, not retreating from suffering the way silence sometimes looks like it might be doing, but moving into it more steadily because of the stillness he had cultivated, helping villages rebuild, walking meditation through landscapes scarred by violence, teaching, decades later, to audiences around the world, a single, deceptively simple practice. Breathe and know you are breathing. Smile and know you are smiling. The silence underneath the breath, he insisted again and again, was never an absence. And it was the one place a person could actually meet what was happening, instead of fleeing from it through words. It is worth noting how directly Thich Nhat Hanh's wartime practice answers a question this story has carried since its very first chapter: whether silence is, at its core, a form of withdrawal from suffering or a form of engagement with it. A man who organized relief efforts, who walked unarmed through landscapes still scarred by recent violence, who founded communities explicitly devoted to staying present with suffering rather than fleeing from it, was not practicing silence as an escape. He was practicing it as the only stable foundation steady enough to act from, in circumstances where panic or despair would have made any action at all impossible to sustain. There is a word in Sanskrit worth ending on, one that gathers up everything this entire story has been circling without ever quite naming directly until now. Tathata, suchness, the simple, complete, unembellished fact of things exactly as they are, before any explanation gets layered on top of them. And alongside it, mana, the sage's vow of silence. Not a withholding, not evasion, not fear, but a discipline, chosen and maintained, that trusts the bare fact of a thing to teach what no further commentary ever could. Here, then, is what this story has actually been carrying, chapter after chapter, silence after silence. From a fig tree in Magadha, to a grove outside Kushinagar, to a cave wall in China, to a forest hermitage in Thailand, to a war-torn village in Vietnam. It is worth pausing before naming these three truths directly. Notice how far we have actually traveled to arrive at them. We began with a man so doubtful of his own discovery that he nearly let it vanish unspoken. We have passed through arrows and lotus flowers, through a king's guilt and a grandmother's grief, through an elephant standing calm before a charge and an elephant standing patient beside a forest hermit, through a chariot taken apart piece by piece in front of a skeptical king and a nun's irreversible act in a quiet grove. Every one of those moments was, in its own way, an answer to the same single underlying question. When does silence serve and when does it merely hide? The first truth, the doctrinal one, not every silence is the same silence. Some questions are set aside because answering them, true or false, would not pull the arrow from the wound. That is Vacchagotta, the undeclared. Some silences withhold an answer because the person asking cannot yet receive any answer safely, either direction. That is the anatta taught to Vacchagotta through total stillness rather than a word that could have trapped him further. And some silences are simply tunibhava, noble silence, the trust that a situation, given enough room, will finish a lesson that further argument never could. It is worth naming one final time a full cast this distinction has required to demonstrate itself properly across this story, because no single example, however vivid, could have carried the whole weight alone. Malunkyaputta needed the arrow. Vacchagotta needed total stillness. Sunakata needed a refusal to perform that only made sense years later, once Pasanati's trust had grown to show what that refusal had actually been protecting. Visakha needed a widening of perspective rather than an explanation. Subha needed an irreversible act rather than either widening or explanation. Ajatasattu needed calm, unflinching presence. And the quarreling monks at Kosambi needed, hardest of all, an absence the Buddha himself could not be certain would ever resolve. Each of these is a different tool, fitted to a different wound, and the entire architecture of this story exists specifically to prevent any single one of them from being mistaken for a universal formula that could simply be applied, unchanged, to every difficult moment a person might face. The second truth, the personal one, and it is worth letting this one actually land. Most of what fills our own days is the opposite of everything this story has shown. We rush to answer questions that were never ours to answer. We defend reputations that steadiness alone would have defended better. We explain grief to people who needed our presence instead of our explanation. We argue with obsessions that no argument was ever going to reach. Nearly every chapter in this story is, in some sense, a mirror held up to exactly the moments in our own lives when we spoke when we should have paused, or stayed silent when someone actually needed us to speak. Think back, for a moment, over your own last few days, and ask honestly which chapter you have most recently been living. Have you been Malunkyaputta, demanding an answer to a question that was never actually the wound that needed tending? Have you been the well-meaning friend offering a grieving person an explanation instead of simply staying? Have you been Sunakata, walking away loudly because someone refused to perform proof on your terms, rather than staying long enough to notice what their steadiness was actually offering instead? None of this is meant as condemnation. It is meant as the kind of mirror this story was always quietly built to be. Chapter after chapter, long before its ending, made the pattern explicit. And the third truth, the one this story has been saving for last, because it is the one that actually costs something to hear, the hardest silences in your own life, the ones you have been most ashamed of, most uncertain about, most quick to call cowardice rather than wisdom, are very often doing more work than you have given them credit for. Not always. Silence can absolutely be avoidance dressed up as patience. Nothing in this story argues otherwise, and the whole arc, from the poisoned arrow to the Kosambi dispute, has been one long demonstration of how much discernment that distinction actually requires. But before you assume your own silence was simply fear, it is worth asking, honestly, the question this entire story has quietly been training you to ask. Was I staying quiet because speaking would have done harm, or because speaking would have cost me something I wasn't ready to pay? There is a simple, practical version of this entire story's method that you can actually carry forward into your own life, distilled from 15 chapters of kings and killers and grieving grandmothers down into something usable on an ordinary afternoon. Before you speak into a hard moment, ask 3 things in quick succession. The way the Buddha's divine eye once surveyed an entire field of lotus flowers before deciding whether and how to act. First, is this question actually the wound, or is it the bow that fired the arrow, a fascinating detail that won't actually change anything if answered? Second, is the person in front of me ready to receive a true answer safely, or would any answer, true or false, simply confirm whichever extreme they are already leaning toward? And third, hardest of all to ask honestly, am I about to speak because the moment calls for it, or because my own discomfort with the silence has become harder to bear than whatever speaking might cost the person I'm speaking to? None of these 3 questions can be answered instantly. None of them come with a guaranteed correct response attached. That difficulty is not a flaw in the method. It is the entire reason this story needed 15 chapters, dozens of named figures, and 2,500 years of accumulated tradition to demonstrate it properly, rather than collapsing into a single tidy rule that could have been stated in 1 sentence at the very beginning and left at that. That is the question worth carrying out of this video and into whatever silence you are sitting in right now, today, in your own life. Was the last thing you didn't say protecting someone, or protecting only yourself? If this story changed how you think about your own silences even a little, that is exactly the kind of thing worth telling me in the comments below. Which moment in this story hit hardest for you and why? And if you found your way here through someone else's recommendation, or through a quiet algorithm doing its own kind of silent work, consider returning the favor. There is a button below this video that does that work for you, simply, without needing you to say anything at all. The fig tree is still there, in a sense, even now, even after everyone who sat beneath it the first time has long since gone. And every time someone learns to tell the difference between the silence that protects and the silence that merely avoids, something of what almost died unspoken under that tree gets spoken again in a new voice in a new century, in a room no one under that tree could have ever imagined. Consider, for a moment, all the rooms this single pattern has now reached simply by virtue of one man deciding, after weeks of genuine doubt, that some people standing close enough to the surface were worth the cost of speaking to. A debate hall in a Greek-ruled Indian kingdom, a cave wall in China, a forest hermitage in Thailand, a village rebuilding itself in wartime Vietnam. And now, however briefly, whatever room or screen you happen to be sitting in front of right now, listening to a story that began on a riverbank in Magadha more than 2,500 years before either of us was born. The silence almost won once, under that tree. It is still, in its way, fighting that same quiet battle every single time someone has to decide in their own life whether to speak or to stay still. And every time someone makes that decision a little more carefully because of a story like this one, the fig tree's shade reaches a little further than it ever could have on its own. That was always the point. Not to end the silence, to learn finally what it had been saying all along.